Hey guys, tonight we begin investigating the gentle, almost meditative art of candle dipping practiced by 18th century makers. We'll wade into warm, slow-moving vats of tallow, swirl in fresh wicks, and discover how the rhythmic drip and dip turned a simple craft into a comforting ritual. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, the gentle ritual of 18th century candle dipping. If you're enjoying this soft dive into antiquity, please like and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. I'd also love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop your location and local time in the comments so we can build our global, sleepy community. Now, find your comfiest spot, dim the lights, turn on a gentle fan, and let every breath slow down. Feel the gentle anticipation as we prepare to drift back in time. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. The world lay hushed beneath a sable sky, as though the night had gathered every whisper into its dark folds. A single lantern swung from my hand, its weak glow breathing life into the empty street before me. My boots tapped softly upon the cobblestones, each echo carried away by the vast silence of the sleeping village. Not yet had the earliest lark begun its call, not even the distant church clock had dared to stir from its slumber. In these moments, just before the first light of dawn, the world feels as if it might pause altogether, and I, guardian of flame, move through that stillness alone. At the edge of the square, under the shuttered windows of my workshop, I halted and lifted the lantern higher. Its amber glow revealed the heavy oak door, studded with tarnished iron rivets. Time had weathered wood and metal both, but neither menace nor decay had robbed it of dignity. With practiced motion, I reached into my leather belt and drew forth a key, simple, wrought of iron, its teeth worn smooth by seasons of turning. I placed the key in the lock's mouth and gave it a gentle twist. The tumbler inside clicked free, and the great door swung inward on oiled hinges, exhaling a quiet groan as if awakening from a deep dream. Stepping through the threshold, I closed the door behind me, cutting off the world's dark expanse. The lantern's glow revealed a chamber built for warmth and craft, stout wooden beams overhead, their broad surfaces streaked with the patina of many seasons, a flagstone floor cool, and even beneath my shoes, shelves along the walls, stocked with tools of iron and wood, racks for drying wick, and stacks of beeswax blocks wrapped in cloth. The air felt chilly here, still holding the night's damp and the memory of yesterday's work. But I had come to rouse it, to coax from these silent walls the promise of light. First, the hearth. I gathered a bundle of kindling, splintered oak twigs, dry elm slats, and the thinnest shavings of pine that crackled at the faintest breath. One by one, I laid them upon the hearth's iron grate, weaving them into a small pyramid. Beneath the hearth, the cavernous forge lay ready, its bellows stowed at one side, the tongs and shovel hung close at hand. I knelt to tend the coals still glowing dimly from yesterday's embers, blowing a gentle breath until orange sparks leapt between black stones. Then, using a small flint and steel, I coaxed a spark into the kindling, feeding it slowly with breath and patience. It caught almost at once, little tongues of flame flickering against the darkness. As the fire drew strength, I fed it with larger sticks, driftwood gathered from the riverbank, chopped lengths of seasoned ash, each piece placed with careful deliberation. The flames climbed higher, spilling warm light across the hearth, making the shadows of the rafters dance upon the walls. I fanned the embers with the bellows, soft, rhythmic sighs of air that stoked the glow until it shone bright and steady. Overhead, the iron hook bore a cauldron, its belly cold and empty, waiting to cradle the blocks of beeswax that would soon transform into candles. I stepped to the wooden shelf where the wax blocks lay in neat rows, their pale honey hue resembling frost-warmed butter. Each block bore the faint impression of the press that had shaped it, a legacy of the hive distilled into solid form. Reaching out, I lifted one and ran a finger along its face. Beeswax holds a subtle warmth even at room temperature, my calloused skin felt it respond, faintly softening beneath my touch. I smelled it then, a sweetness almost floral, with a distant echo of golden combs and summer's sunlit fields. I placed the block beside the hearth and began to stack its fellows, arranging them in a tidy pile beside the cauldron's rim. Returning to the fire, I readjusted the bellows, noting how the flames now wrapped around the cauldron's feet with gentle insistence. The iron vessels began to hum with heat, the metal surface turning dull red. Heat radiated into the chill air, coaxing puffs of steam from the damp stones at the hearth's edge. I knelt once more, leaning close to the cauldron, and watched as the bottommost wax block sagged ever so slightly, its edges beginning to glow with inner light. Then, with a small iron hook, I dragged the block into the molten stir. Instantly, a soft hiss rose, like a sigh from deep within the wax. Steam rose in pale tendrils, curling toward the rafters, carrying with it the scent of melted honey and smoldering wood. The wax pool around the block bubbled gently, the edges losing their form and blending into a pale golden liquid. My paddle, wrought of black iron, dipped slowly, stirring the wax with deliberate care. The surface shimmered in the firelight, reflecting every flicker, every curl of smoke. I noticed how the liquid wax seemed almost alive, like a quiet lake at dawn disturbed by a single pebble. I paused, paddle in hand, and listened. The hiss of wax and the crackle of fire blended into a soft symphony. In its rhythm, I heard centuries of practice, the candlemakers before me who rose in darkness, who coaxed their materials into light for village homes, for midnight travelers, for families who would greet the morning by their glow. The ritual unfolded in predictable steps, yet never the same twice. Each dawn brought a new play of light and shadow, of scent and sigh. In this moment, I felt suspended between night and day, between the cold past and the warm promise that my craft would bring. Slowly, methodically, I fetched the remaining blocks from the wooden shelf. One by one, they entered the cauldron's embrace, each adding its voice to the hiss and swell. My apron bore small flecks of wax, tiny pale dots that gleamed like morning stars. My lantern swung at my side, its flame steady but meek compared to the fire below. Outside, I knew the east would begin to pale soon, as the sun prepared its ascent. But here, within this modest workshop, the world turned according to another cycle, one measured in wax and flame, in soft glows and gentle warmth. By the time the last block had liquefied, the hearth burned with a confident roar. The cauldron's mouth held a pool of molten gold, its surface clear and bright, unmarred by the scum that would later rise to the top. I set down my paddle and reached for a small iron skimmer. With quiet strokes, I skimmed the wax's surface, collecting the impurities that floated there, dark specks of bark, flecks of charred wood, faint shadows of the day before. Each pass of the skimmer revealed a purer depth below, a clarity that would yield clean burning candles. At last the chemical dance settled into tranquil warmth. I allowed the fire to ease back on itself, pulling the bellows aside, adjusting the logs so that the flame embraced the cauldron without scorching its rim. I wiped my paddle on a rag and hung it upon its hook. Then I straightened, inhaling deeply. The workshop felt different now, awakened, yes, with heat and light, but also held in a quiet peace. The hiss had subsided to a gentle murmur, as though the wax itself were breathing, content in its molten state. I leaned the lantern against the wall and stepped back. My boots made no sound on the flagstones, my eyes adjusted to the interplay of firelight and shadow. In that warm glow, pallets and racks stood ready, as though awaiting the slender linen wicks and the tender dips to come. Outside, I sensed a faint bird call, perhaps the first lark, or the twitter of a sparrow venturing from its nest. Beyond the shuttered windows, the sky hinted at pale blue. Inside, the hearth's fire had become my own silent companion, guiding each thought and each motion. Thus the workshop had awakened before dawn. The forge stood stoked, the cauldron filled, the wax purified. All was prepared for the day's gentle, patient ritual, the dipping of wicks, the layering of wax, the birth of candles that would carry light into countless homes and hearts. And as I stood there, lantern darkened, hearth glowing, I felt the promise of that first glow before dawn, a spark of warmth that would endure, long after the early light had broken across the world. Before the pale fingers of dawn brushed the sky, the candlemaker steps from the workshop's warmth into a deeper hush. Each footfall is measured on the cold, stone-flagged floor as he crosses the short corridor that links the forge chamber with the storeroom. A lantern in one hand, its wick trimmed to a steady glow, he turns the iron ring on the heavy door. The bolt slides free with a muted click that seems unnaturally loud in the silence. He pushes against the thick oak and slips inside. The air within is cooler, tinged with the memory of seasons met and past. Low arched beams span overhead, faint cobwebs clinging in dusty corners where the lamp's circle of light does not reach. Along each wall stand rough-hewn shelves of elm and ash, their surfaces worn smooth by years of careful handling. On these shelves rest perfect rectangles of beeswax, pale as winter moonlight. They are arranged in neat rows, stacked 2 or 3 high, each block a little different from the one beside it. Some are almost white, their texture translucent and serene, others bear a faint golden hue, as though the last warmth of the hive has seeped into their core. Here and there, a block shows a faint impurity, a tiny brown fleck, the trace of a bee's wing, the faintest ripple in the wax's otherwise flawless face. He pauses a moment in the threshold, breathing in the subtle fragrance of honey and thyme. This fragrance is more than mere scent, it is memory raised on a breeze. He remembers summer days amid the hives, the low, reassuring drone of thousands of bees at work, the bright hum of sunlit comb as he uncapped cells and pressed warm wax through coarse cloth. That honeyed aroma, distilled now into solid blocks, carries every one of those moments forward into the gray hush of early morning. He steps deeper, mindful of the quiet, and lowers the lantern onto a shelf at chest height. The flame flutters as he leans in, revealing a dozen pristine blocks whose straight edges catch the light like facets of a gem. With calloused fingers, he lifts the nearest block from its resting place. It is cool to the touch, smooth and scarcely substantial in his hand. He turns it slowly, examining the straight cuts of its sides, the gentle curve of its top, where a faint seam marks the meeting of mold halves. Light plays across its surface, soft beams from the lantern dancing in welcome. He brings a small cube forward and glides his thumb along the flat exterior, feeling for any sign of imperfection. His fingertip finds a barely perceptible indentation, an ancient pressure point, where the wax contracted more keenly as it cooled. Beneath the surface, the block seems to glow, beneath his thumb it offers firm but forgiving resistance, like the cheek of a good friend at rest. He breaks off a sliver with a slender knife. The blade yields smoothly, slicing a shard of wax that curls away in a fragile ribbon. He holds the piece to his eye, backlit by the lantern, to trace its translucence. Like a gathered ray of morning star, it gleams in miniature, enough to awaken wonder in a seasoned hand. He raises the sliver to his nose. The fragrance is immediate, sweet honey tempered by the soft warmth of bees' nests, yet underlaid by a quiet earthiness. He breathes deeply, allowing the gentle aroma to settle into his memory. With his fingertips, he presses the fragment between thumb and forefinger, testing for purity. If the wax contains too much propolis or hidden debris, the fragment will crumble or yield an uneven texture. But this piece holds firm, the shards breaking neatly as they should, a testament to the hive's bounty and the careful washing and rendering that followed its harvest. Satisfied, he returns the knife to its leather sheath and places the sliver gently in a small dish. Later, when the wax in the cauldron has softened, he will use a piece like this as the first test drop, small enough to melt quickly in the heat, yet substantial enough to reveal any speck of impurity. He watches the curled ribbon of wax settle in the dish and then turns his attention back to the shelves. One by one, he selects enough blocks to fill the cauldron at the forge hearth, a dozen in all, weighing nearly 50 pounds combined. He arranges them on a low wooden bench in front of the hearth's glow, careful to keep the edges from chipping. As he works, the hearth's ember breathes in a steady rhythm, hinting at the warmth to come. He shifts the blocks so that their narrow faces catch the heat first, coaxing the wax to soften ever so slightly before the actual melt. The room is faintly illuminated by the hearth, now winking with tiny sparks, and by the steady beam of the lantern. Motes of dust drift lazily in the air, each grain outlined in gold. A single droplet of wax, loosened by the gentle heat, falls from a block's corner. It plops softly onto the stone floor, spreading in a tiny, perfect circle before quickly cooling again. The candlemaker stoops to survey it. Even in this inadvertent sample, he finds reassurance, clear, smooth, and unblemished by dark specks or dregs. He straightens, brushes a stray lock of hair from his forehead, and surveys his harvest. The blocks rest side by side, their pale surfaces lined up in quiet order. Age has taught him that beeswax, though durable, pays tribute to the calendar. Blocks from early spring, rendered when cold still ruled the hive, will behave differently than late summer yields, when comb dripped with solar warmth. He notes each block's origin in his mind, the first 3 from a cold weather extraction, the next 4 from early June, the final 5 from the height of July's bloom. In time, he will melt them in sequence or blend them to achieve the perfect balance of firmness and fluidity, clarity and color. Mindful of the day's unfolding, he steps back. The storeroom is at once a sanctuary and a starting point. Here lies the heartwood of the week's work, the pure, honeyed substance that, transformed by fire and guided by patient hands, will become the candles to light many homes. Outside, the east sky has begun to pale, faint wisps of pink and lavender threading through the darkness. He takes a last, lingering breath of cold air, carrying with it that subtle trace of beeswax sweetness. Then, with deliberate care, he unhooks the lantern from its shelf, clasps it firmly, and backs toward the door. With one hand on the cool iron latch, he lingers just long enough to admire the oils of wax that gleam on each block, oils born of countless summers, of shuttle flights through blossom-laden air. He closes the heavy door behind him, seals it with a bolt and steps back into the hearthlit arc of the workshop. As he returns the harvested blocks to their final station by the cauldron, he feels a deep stillness settle in his bones. The ritual of selecting and testing wax is complete. The gathering of raw material, quiet and deliberate, has set the tone for the work to come. In this gentle early hour, he senses the quiet promise of transformation, that these pale, golden blocks will soon yield to flame, become molten, and then, in patient layers, build themselves into slender pillars of light. A simple truth warms him in that moment: the slow unfolding of craft, carried out day by day, transforms raw gift into lasting glow. He places the last block beside the cauldron, steps back, and lets the lantern's glow fall upon the neat rows. The stage is set. All that remains is the fire beneath and the measured stir of wax to follow. In the hush of dawn, the candlemaker allows himself a small nod of quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow's light begins here, in the careful harvest of beeswax blocks, in the fealty paid to purity and patience, and in the unhurried rhythm of a slow, glowing craft. The workshop's low ceiling holds steady echoes of early morning ritual. From the far corner, the cauldron's iron rim glints faintly in the lantern light, promising warmth and transformation. The candlemaker, sleeves rolled high on his forearms, stands before the hearth, where embers smolder beneath a bed of ash. He breathes in the subtle scent of scorched wood mingled with sweet promise of beeswax soon to flow. Outside, the world remains hushed, save for sparrows stirring beyond the single window's foggy pane. Here within, all tasks revolve around a single purpose: coaxing gleaming wax from block to pool, forging both fuel and comfort against the coming darkness of night. Slowly, with practiced care, he reaches for the wrought iron paddle, its handle worn smooth by years of steady hands. He plants one boot upon a timber plank, shifting weight as he dips the paddle's broad blade into the warming wax. At first, the wax clings in gentle resistance, a thick, honeyed mass surrendering to tool and touch. Each stroke is deliberate, drawing a graceful arc through the molten sea. The paddle's flat edge parts the surface, creating ripples that lap quietly against the cauldron walls. Here, in this quiet hour, the candlemaker feels time slow to a soft thrum, measured not by minutes or hours, but by the wax's gradual yielding to fire and motion. He stirs in long, even sweeps, watching as the pale gold deepens in hue. Tiny bubbles release in a soft hiss, as hidden moisture bursts free and evaporates into the draught above. Flames dance along the cauldron's lip in tongues of orange, green, and blue, each flicker telling of heat's precise embrace. Were he to stir too quickly, the wax might foam or scorch, too slowly, and cold pockets would form, inviting streaks of impurities to remain. Thus, each turn of the paddle carries the weight of patience and knowledge, handed down in silent demonstration from master to apprentice over countless seasons. As the wax folds into a uniform, liquid ribbon, dark impurities rise in tiny motes and scum along the surface. Bits of leaf pollen from the hives, stray bits of propolis, and minute particles of dust collected in transit, all gather in a narrow margin where wax meets iron. The candlemaker tilts the paddle gently, allowing the unwelcome fragments to adhere to its edge. He lifts them free and brushes them into a small iron pan at his side, where they will cool into brittle chips, destined for future remelting or disposal. This skimming is a measured art. Too much zeal, and precious wax is lost, too little and the candles risk blemish, a flaw in their clear finish. Between strokes, he leans forward to peer into the pool, gauging its texture and clarity. His lantern casts a golden column across the surface, illuminating threadbare patterns of streaks and patches. In the cool air of the nearly dawn, the pool should remain smooth as glass, without the slightest ripple of undue agitation. A faint curl of smoke drifts upward as he relaxes his grip, and for an instant, the world holds its breath at the meeting of wax and wick, fire and ice, maker and material. When the impurities have been removed to his satisfaction, he turns his attention to the hearth's embers. The bellows hang to one side, sculpted by countless squeezes into an almost living creature of wood and leather. He lifts the nozzle and puffs a soft breath of air into the coals. The embers flare brighter, streaks of red and white hot ash pushing outward against darker remnants. A sweet warmth swells in the room, filling every corner with reassurance. Smoke drifts upward in leisurely spirals before finding its way to the chimney, where it escapes into the pale sky. Beneath the cauldron, logs are arranged in a tidy stack, each piece chosen for clean burn and steady heat. The candlemaker rearranges them with a metal hook, wedging smaller twigs between larger billets to encourage even combustion. He notices slight hollows forming in the pile, pockets where airflow might falter, and gently shifts the wood to maintain consistent flames. As he works, the forge's crackle becomes a measured pulse beneath the wax pot, beating in time with the stir of his paddle. In this calm interlude, he allows himself a moment of reflection. The act of stirring wax is not merely a labor of the hand, but a meditation of the mind. Each stroke clears the surface of impurity and doubt, each breath of bellows rekindles resolve. 1,000 details conspire to shape the final candle, the exact heat, the purest wax, the smoothest surface, and he navigates them all with equal parts reverence and resolve. The world outside may hurry toward markets and errands, but here exists a slower pulse, dictated by the wax's gentle will and the fire's respectful obedience. The lantern guttering at his side flickers as a wisp of draft finds its way through a slight gap in the door. He adjusts the iron hook closing the crack, then returns to his paddle. The wax has reached the perfect consistency, fluid enough to coat but not so hot as to thin and drip before shaping. Its surface gleams like a frozen lake at sunrise, awaiting a first step, a nip of wick to begin the candle's journey. He sets the paddle aside and lifts a small ladle from the side table. Gently he pours a spoonful of molten wax onto a flat stone, warning himself against haste. The drop spreads in a perfect circle, and he presses his fingertip to its edge. Warmth spreads in a slow tide, confirming the wax's readiness. Satisfied, he nods to himself and steps back. The fire has done its work, the wax is pure, and now the true craft may proceed. A hush settles over the workshop as daylight begins to brush the sky. The candlemaker draws a slow breath, savoring the mingled aromas of smoke and honeyed wax. Soon enough, linen wicks will dip and gather layer upon layer of this molten gold. Soon enough, the candles will stand in neat rows along racks of polished oak, transformed from flickering potential into steadfast sentinels of light. But for now, in this gentle interval between harvest and artistry, the wax fires burn with quiet promise, and the maker waits, paddle at rest, ready to begin the next chapter of patient creation. The morning chill still clung to the stone floors of the workshop when the candlemaker stepped forward, lantern in hand, to begin the delicate task that would determine the very soul of every candle to come. The air smelled of beeswax's slow promise, warmed just enough last night to a gentle fluidity, and of smoldering ember ash from the hearth. Though the forge fires had dwindled since the night's final stirrings, a faint glow lingered in the blackened iron cauldron. It was here, in the soft hush, that the candlemaker positioned a low stool near a narrow wooden table before turning to retrieve the spool of fine linen wick. On the table, which bore years of wax stains and minute grooves carved by countless tools, rested a bobbin of unbleached, cream-colored thread, each strand as slender as a spider's silk yet strong enough to draw molten wax and carry a tender flame. The bobbin itself had been roughly turned from aged oak, its surface worn smooth by grain and hands alike, and balanced quietly between the candlemaker's fingertips. Carefully, almost reverently, a single end of wick was coaxed free, sliding from its neat coil with a whisper of friction, and draped across the tabletop's edge. First, the candlemaker allowed the wick to rest for a moment in the glow of the lantern, gauging its fibers with practiced eyes. Each thread was examined for consistency. A drop of wax from last night's skimming adhered to the end of the wick, proof that it had been pre-treated, primed enough for the coming dip, yet still supple enough to absorb the wax in even layers. The candlemaker pinched the tip between calloused fingers, rolling it gently to ensure there were no loose strands or minuscule knots. It was a ritual in itself, a slow dance of touch and sight, one foot on centuries of history, the other on the promise of light. Once satisfied, the candlemaker turned to a small brass scale, its two shallow pans balanced on a central beam. The pans were empty and silent under the lamplight. Nearby stood a set of lead weights, each carefully labeled, 1 grain, 5 grains, 20 grains, and polished smooth by countless hands before. The candlemaker lifted the lid of a wooden box, and from within retrieved a batch of meticulously prepared wicks, each previously measured but now in need of exact trimming. With a soft exhale, a single wick was laid upon one pan while a 5-grain weight was placed on the other. The beam dipped slightly under the weight, and then, ever so slightly, the candlemaker lifted and lowered the wick, feeling for the precise moment when both sides balanced in equilibrium. In that gentle balance, the candlemaker sensed more than weight, a symmetry of future flame, the promise of a steady burn. With a thin-bladed shears, its edges honed to a razor's edge, the wick was clipped, producing a crisp, silent snap. The cut end revealed a neat cross-section of tightly woven strands, as if each had been spun by patient bees in some golden hive of craftsmanship. The candlemaker repeated this process until the table bore a small bundle of equally measured lengths, scores of slender cords, each a template for the candles about to emerge. Between cuts, the candlemaker paused to light a second candle, freshly trimmed at its base, and held it low to the worktable. The flame flickered, warm and familiar, casting dancing shadows across the bobbin and scale. By the lamplight's glow the candlemaker could see the smallest fibers of the wick begin to char ever so faintly at the tip. With a decisive inhale, the flickering flame was coaxed closer to the fresh cords. One by one, each length of wick was passed briefly through the candle's gentle flame. The purpose was twofold: to seal the cut end and remove any remaining loose fibers, and to introduce a preliminary coating of wax that would help anchor the forthcoming layers. In that brief moment, the white linen turned a subtle ivory, and the faint scent of singed cotton mingled with honeyed beeswax. Reassembling the now primed wicks in tidy rows upon the tabletop, the candlemaker reflected on the origins of this practice. Centuries ago, every household might spin their own threads and dip their own candles in solitude. Over time, the craft had been refined into a ritual, one that melded precision and patience, solitude and ceremony. And though the world outside these thick walls might rush toward the bustle of market and field, here time moved to the rhythm of measured dips and whispered breaths. Having prepared the wicks, the candlemaker turned to the cauldron. A gentle steam rose from the molten wax, tracing lazy trails toward the rafters. On a small iron trivet beside the hearth, a skillet of fresh beeswax dripped ever so slowly, its surface rippling with a pale sheen. The candlemaker lifted a long-handled scoop and tested the temperature with a drop upon the back of a wrist, warm, but not too hot, just above the point where wax flows most freely, yet below that threshold where it might blister or darken. Satisfied, the candlemaker lowered the basket-work rack of prepared wicks to the table's edge, ready for their first preliminary dip. With deliberate care, a single wick was drawn taut between thumb and forefinger, then dipped into the molten wax. A faint hiss greeted the submersion, as the wax embraced the linen, seeping into each microscopic fiber. The candlemaker held it submerged for a heartbeat longer than they might think necessary, ensuring every strand was coated in a thin veil of liquid gold. Then, with a slow, steady lift, the wick emerged. Beneath the lantern's glow the coating shone like pale morning dew. A few beads of wax dripped to the well below, returning to the cauldron as droplets of promise. The candlemaker rotated the wick gently in midair, watching as the wax formed an even preliminary layer, and then rested it upon a slender wooden rod to set. One by one, each wick followed the same pattern: dip, lift, rotate, rest. The rods were positioned in neat rows upon the rack, each cord hanging straight and parallel to its neighbor, as if soldiers standing guard over the dawn. As the wax cooled, it lost its liquid sheen and took on a matte creaminess, soft to the eye and firm to the touch. The candlemaker paused to whisper a quiet blessing, a gesture born of habit rather than formal prayer, for it was gratitude more than anything that guided each movement here. Gratitude for the bees, the plants, the honey that fed them, and the wax that flowed from their hives. Gratitude for the loom that wove linen threads so fine. And gratitude for the simple ritual that gave shape to light. By the time the last wick had been primed, a hush had settled over the workshop. The first rays of dawn filtered through a small window high on the west wall, illuminating the rack of prepared wicks in a glow of promise. In those pale beams, the candlemaker discerned the outline of every fiber, every line where wax met thread. Each one awaited its next transformation, the first true dip, the layering that would thicken and strengthen it, the shaping that would make it more than a cord, but a vessel for flame. For now, though, they stood in silent vigil, letting the moment stretch between breath and heartbeat, between what had been done and what would soon be. In the meticulous unspooling and cutting and dipping, the candlemaker had threaded the future, one slender ribbon at a time. And as the workshop brightened with the coming sun, that future glowed in an array of pale cords, each destined to become a gentle beacon in the gathering dusk of countless evenings yet to unfold. Long before the sun's pale fingers reach across the rooftops, the candlemaker stands at the edge of the great kettle. The wax within shimmers faintly like liquid pearl, heated just enough that its surface ripples without rising into violent heat. The room is hushed except for the low murmur of embers and the gentle hiss where the wax meets the fiery iron beneath. Here, in this steady warmth, the candlemaker prepares to give form to something both simple and profound, the first, feather-light layer of wax upon each pristine linen wick. He selects a single wick from the wooden rack where countless lengths lie waiting, each one already primed with a thin coat of wax applied in the previous chapter's ritual. Its surface is smooth to the fingertips, as soft and pale as silk woven by moonlight. He holds it as though cradling a small bird, gentle, deliberate, perfectly still. The wick's end dangles over the molten surface, and for a moment he breathes in the warmth that rises from the kettle, the gently honeyed scent of beeswax that has been purified through fire and patience. Slowly, carefully, he lowers the tip of the wick into the molten pool. There is a soft, almost liquid sigh as the wax parts around the wick, clinging in a thin, delicate film. Holding it just so, he watches intently, the first feather of coating glinting in the dim glow, silver against amber. A single drop forms at the end, hanging heavy for an instant before releasing in a tiny plop that returns to the cauldron. His fingers remain steady. He counts in silence, 1, 2, the length of time needed for that perfect layer to adhere evenly but lightly, no thicker than a moth's wing. Then, with a practiced motion, he lifts the wick, drawing it slowly upward so that the layer stretches translucent and fine. He holds the newly coated wick aloft for a heartbeat. The glow of the nearby lantern flickers across its surface, revealing an almost imperceptible sheen. The candlemaker's eyes trace the length of wax from base to tip, ensuring there are no bubbles, no uneven ridges. In that stillness, time seems to pause, the hush of the workshop grows deeper, as though the walls themselves listen to this quiet, perfect moment. Finally content, he lays the wick across a wooden rack beside him. The rack is simple, two parallel beams joined by slender ribs, but it holds each wick at just the right angle. This angle encourages the wax to drain back slowly toward the base, creating a taper that will one day become a slender, elegant candle. He places it with care, spacing it evenly from its companions. In the dim light, the new coating gleams faintly, each wick a promise of illumination that will emerge only after many more dips and many more hours of patient work. The candlemaker steps back and surveys the rack. The scene is almost ascetic in its restraint, rows of wicks, each one newly touched by the molten wax, waiting silently in even lines. The only movement is the slightest drip as remaining beads of wax fall away, tiny pearlescent tears pooling on the tray below. He breathes in, tasting the sweetness of the beeswax and the mineral edge of hot iron. The air is cool here too, drawn in from cracks beneath the door, mingling with the amber glow and reminding him of the dawn chill beyond the workshop walls. In this calm, he reflects on the history of this moment. Generations of candlemakers have stood in this same posture, cupping a fragile wick, feeling the pliant give of the wax against their fingers. They have listened to the same soft plop and watched new layers form, never rushing, never forcing. Each layer is a lesson in restraint. Add too much and the candle will be lumpy, drip too quickly and it will be weak. The first dip is always the most delicate, the foundation upon which the future candle grows, layer by layer. He selects a second wick and repeats the motion, gently dipping, counting the silent seconds, lifting to reveal another perfect film of wax. Then a third. And a fourth. The rhythm builds, but it remains slow. With each immersion, the candlemaker's pulse aligns with the hiss of the wax and the glow of the coals. His hands move almost without thought now, guided by muscle memory and a lifetime of practice. The tips of his fingers remain unscorched, for he has learned to trust the thickness of his gloves and the distance between skin and flame. Still, he never lets his guard down, every dip is an act of intention. As the row lengthens, he murmurs a blessing under his breath, an old candlemaker's charm for even coating in steady light. The words are soft, half forgotten, carried from one generation to the next, little more than a whisper in his ear. Perhaps it is superstition, or perhaps simply gratitude to the bees and the earth from which the wax was drawn. Either way, it brings a slight smile to his lips and a deeper quiet to the workshop. When the rack can hold no more, he pauses. His arms feel the gentle ache of repeated motion, but his spirit is invigorated by the unfolding rows of softly gleaming wicks. These thin pillars of wax, each one born from careful measurement and patient skill, stand ready for the next stage, setting, cooling, and the many subsequent dips that will build their bodies strong enough to burn with a steady, unwavering flame. He lifts the rack and carries it a step away from the kettle, placing it in a cooler draft where the wax can set slowly. The rack's wooden beams feel cooler to the touch now, tinged with morning air. He turns it slightly, ensuring each wick hangs straight, that no one touches its neighbor. And then he steps back once more, allowing the candles a moment to rest and mature in the stillness. Behind him, the embers glow softly, and the cauldron waits. He has already filled fresh linen wicks, primed and ready, on another bobbin. When these first ones have set just enough, they must remain tacky to accept the next coats. He will return with the same care and begin again. But for now, he allows himself a moment to simply behold the fruits of his labor, those pale lines of wax, nearly transparent in the gentle light, poised on the brink of becoming vessels of warm, guiding flame. In the hush that follows, he steps toward the door and opens it just enough to let in a breath of dawn. A faint chorus of birds stirs in the yard, their song still muted by distance. A chill breeze brings the scent of dew and cold earth, a reminder that beyond this little crucible of fire and wax lies the waking world, its needs vast and fluttering. The candles will soon be bundled, counted, sold, or carried home by candlelight for supper. But first, they must grow, layer upon layer, each dip a pledge to the quiet ritual that shapes them and shapes the night. With a final glance at the rack, the candlemaker closes the door against the chill. Inside, the workshop resumes its gentle rhythm, the kettle's heat, the embers glow, the steady beat of his heart in time with the dipping. And so, with these first ephemeral coats firmly set, the art of the candle begins in earnest, each waxen thread promising comfort, safety, and a soft illumination in the hours yet to come. The gray light of early dawn pressed softly against the workshop's dusty panes as the candlemaker carried his first bundle of freshly dipped wicks across the stone floor. The racks, long, low trestles fashioned from aged oak, stood waiting beside the hearth, each rail grooved just enough to cradle a slender candle without letting it roll free. He set the bundle down, listening to the faint scrape of wood on stone, and reached for the first wick, still supple with warm wax. Each movement was measured, deliberate, an unhurried gesture born of many seasons spent in this gentle ritual. Guided by the dim glow of embers still flickering in the hearth, he aligned the candle's base within the shallow notch of the top rail. The wax was half set, its surface a pale, opaline sheen that caught stray light like moonlit water. He pressed the stub of the wick against the wood and tilted the candle slightly, watching as a droplet of residual wax slid back into its form, smoothing a tiny wrinkle in the newly formed surface. A subtle satisfaction warmed him, far gentler than the heat of flame, as he lifted his hand and moved to the next groove. Around him, the hush of the workshop was profound. In the corner, the kettle of molten wax murmured softly beneath the steady breath of the bellows, but here at the drying rack, all was still. The candlemaker's cloak brushed the floor with each step, and his leather boots left no mark on the worn flagstones. He placed candle after candle, spacing them evenly, so that as they cooled and contracted in the morning chill, none would lean or cling to its neighbor. It was a matter of subtlety, too close, and they might fuse in the night, too far apart, and the small drafts drifting through the open window would chill them unevenly. He paused after the 10th candle, stepping back to survey the neat row. The half-set wax glowed like pale ivory in the soft dawn haze, each form slender and precise as a sentry standing guard. Beyond the window, the eastern sky had begun to brighten, veins of milk-white light spreading slowly across clouds that still carried the hush of night. A single bird called from a distant bough, its voice clear in the stillness, and the candlemaker drew a quiet breath of cold air, tasting the promise of another day. An hour passed before he turned the rack. A gentle, deliberate motion, raising one end, pivoting it on narrow dowels, and lowering it until the opposite side faced the hearth. This twist ensured that the thin skin of wax that had set first would dry at the same pace as the thicker underlayers. If left unturned, the top side, exposed to the warmer air near the fire, would harden too quickly, forming a brittle shell that might crack when the rest of the candle cooled. By turning the rack, he invited equilibrium, a slow patience between fire and chill. He repeated this turning thrice as the sky brightened from pearl gray to a soft buttercup yellow. Each time, he examined the candles closely. Some bore the merest undulations, tiny ridges formed where the drips of successive dips had settled. He traced a fingertip along one such ridge, feeling its whisper of roughness, then pressed again until it vanished, the warmth of his skin smoothing the imperfection. These candles would become the light by which families read their prayers, by which merchants tallied accounts, by which lovers stole quiet embraces. They had to stand flawless, each one a testament to the candlemaker's unhurried care. He took a moment to replenish his lantern with fresh oil and trimmed its wick, watching the flame lean into the draught as the workshop door stood ajar to welcome the day. A fine shaft of light struck the middle of the rack, illuminating the candles in profile. Their outlines glowed translucent on the edges, each slender rod poised between solidity and fluidity. In that hush, the candlemaker felt the centuries beneath his hands, the long line of artisans who, before him, had performed this same rite, dipping, drying, turning, waiting. It was a lull that required no words, only the careful choreography of wax and wick. As he straightened the lantern, a cool breeze swept through, skimming across the candle's pale surfaces. He watched as the breeze carried away a delicate puff of warmth from the hearth, causing one candle's surface to bloom in a swift, near-invisible wave of condensation. Beads of moisture formed on the wax like dewdrops on a spring morning, and he leaned forward to witness the small miracle of texture shifting in time. Gently, He tapped the rail, and the drops coalesced into a single bead that slipped back into the pool of wax at the candle's foot. The candlemaker smiled to himself. Even in this quiet hour, nature offered lessons in balance and transience. Daylight now filled the room, soft yet clear, banishing the faintest shadows. He took a spool of linen twine and marked each of the 3 racks with a simple chalk line: first drying, second to come, and final finish. The empty racks stood ready, patient witnesses to the next stages of dipping. But for this moment, his gaze returned to the first row. He marveled at how the candles, uniform as they were, retained subtle signs of their birth: a slight bulge where the wax first gathered, a faint spiral where the wick had been rotated. Such details, he thought, were the soul of the craft. Stepping closer, he drew in a slow breath of honeyed air, perfumed by the warming wax and the faint trace of bees' labor still clinging to each candle. This smell, more than any sound or sight, anchored him in the centuries. He closed his eyes and let the memory of every dawn spent in this workshop settle around him like a second skin. The rhythm was constant: dip, dry, turn, examine, repeat. A rhythm that eased both maker and created into a shared destiny of light. By the time the candlemaker finally allowed himself a pause, the candles had cooled to a firm touch, their surfaces matte and pale. He reached out and picked one up, rolling it gently between his palms. It felt solid, balanced, complete in its modest shape. Setting it aside, he unfastened his cloak and hung it on a peg near the door. He poured a small cup of water from a pewter jug and sipped it slowly, letting the coldness wash away the warmth of the forge fire on his fingertips. Outside, the village was coming to life. He could hear the muted clang of a smith's hammer, the far-off clatter of wagon wheels on cobbles, the soft hiss of a kettle on someone's hearth. But within these walls, time seemed to stretch, each moment lingering like the thin smoke that curled upward from the dying ember in his lantern. He straightened his back, flexed his fingers, and approached the next rack. In this calm interlude, he found purpose. The next layer of wax awaited its turn to transform silk and melted honey into something that would banish darkness in the humblest of homes. With measured care, the candlemaker removed the first row of solidified candles and carried them to a clean plank beside the hearth. There, in the gentle warmth of the forge, they would be primed for their second dip. He smiled, feeling the soft assurance of a day unfolding in perfectly paced stages. The rack stood empty now, ready to receive the next offering of half-set wax and patient devotion. And above it all, the dawn light held its quiet vigil, blessing the candles with promise even before they shone. The pale morning light had scarcely crept across the workroom windows when the candlemaker returned to the cauldron, still humming with a gentle warmth from the hours before. In the hush between the half-set wax on the racks and the next cycle of dipping, there was a moment of suspended quiet, an interlude in which the only movement was the thin spiral of steam rising from the molten pool. This was Chapter 7, Temperature and Texture, wherein the craft hinged not on grand gestures, but on subtle calibrations of heat and the tender removal of every faint speck of impurity. A faint glow clung to the dark iron kettle's rim as the candlemaker approached. He carried, in a small wooden bowl, a glimmering drop of molten beeswax, freshly lifted from the surface by a slender spoon. He paused beside the hearth, inhaling the faint aroma of honeyed warmth, and with practiced care he tilted the bowl toward the workbench. From a folded rag he produced a single clean finger, the skin still cool against the waxy air, and dipped its tip into the liquid gold. He allowed the bead to spread across the back of his hand, feeling its weight and warmth. This simple test was as essential as any tool in the shop: too hot, and the wax risked scorching, its hue would darken, its scent would bite with bitter notes of smoke; too cool, and it might set too rapidly upon the wick, forming an uneven crust that would mar the candle's smooth lines. As the wax melded with his skin's natural heat, he monitored its shift from fluid to fleeting film, judging the exact moment when it began to stiffen. In that breath of time, he discerned the cauldron's true temper. Once satisfied, he set the bowl aside and turned to the looming bellows. Each exhale he drew from them fueled the hearth below, and in this chamber of flickering shadows, the candlemaker treated flame as if it were a living thing, sending it gentle sighs or vigorous breaths, depending on the mood the wax required. He placed both hands on the aged wooden lever, its surface smooth from years of guiding fire, and pressed softly. A soft gust rushed through the grate, reigniting a quiet chorus of embers. Then, pausing, he allowed the coals to settle before breathing again, maintaining a low, even heat. A hush followed, and he listened to the deep, measured murmur as wax at the bottom of the kettle began to stir. Tiny ripples formed on its surface as if an invisible hand were combing its skin. He dipped a hooked skimmer into the pool, dragging it slowly forward. On its wrought iron edge clung thin, dark flecks, little fragments of wick char, minute bits of debris carried down from the earlier firings. With composure, he skimmed away each blemish, wiping the blade upon a scrap of linen. Each scrap he deposited in a small metal pan, collecting the scum until the wax mirrored the sky beyond the window, a clear, pale amber, untroubled by shadows. In the concentrated light of a single candle, he examined the molten surface again. Now it rippled without interruption, a clear mirror into which he could see his own reflection leaning above it, the soft rise of his brow, the gentle set of his shoulders. He thought then of how every layer of wax would build upon this foundation. If the wax beneath were flawed, the thick, even coats he planned would only magnify those imperfections. So he continued to refine, raising the heat by subtle increments, lowering it until the surface was calm, and always skimming. Between adjustments, he let his gaze drift to the racks upon which the morning's first dips dried. Each slender form glowed faintly, like rows of pale sentinels awaiting the next stage of their creation. Their surfaces were still cool to the touch, but soon enough, each would be returned to the cauldron for a second coat, one that would give substance, strength, and shine. Yet first, the wax must be brought to its ideal, malleable state, neither too fluid nor too firm, so that every candle would emerge slender but steadfast. The candlemaker moved now to the worktable, retrieving a slender rod of smooth brass. With it he tapped the kettle's side, listening to the embrace of resonant tones. A deeper note meant greater volume of wax, a higher pitch suggested a cycle too low. It was less measurement than music, a song of metal and fire that only the practiced ear could interpret. He tapped again, inhaled through his nose, then rotated the brass rod and tapped a third time. Now the sound was nearer his intent. He nodded in quiet approval. Retracing his steps to the hearth, he adjusted the bellows once more, pressing down with a firm hand. The coals glowed brighter, and wisps of warmth danced into the air, carrying the distant memory of wildflower fields and the soft drone of bees. The candlemaker reached for his skimmer again, and the blade slipped smoothly through the surface. No impurity rose. Satisfied, he let the tool rest at his side, its edge still gleaming faintly. A breath later, he turned once more to the wooden bowl of wax waiting on the bench. Picking it up, he allowed a few drops to run along the rim, watching them stretch into delicate threads before falling back to the pool. He noted their descent, the way they tapered into fine points, and smiled softly at the perfection of such minute details. Then, lowering the bowl, he laid it gently upon a piece of sanded board, preparing for the next scene in the ritual. In these silent intervals, the workshop seemed to sigh with contentment. The midday chill had not yet arrived, and the chamber hung between warmth and coolness. Patches of morning light hit the wall, trailing beneath wooden beams, and in that glow, motes of wax dust drifted as though carried on invisible currents. The candlemaker paused, allowing his mind to drift alongside them, reflecting on the centuries that had passed since candlemakers first discovered this gentle art. But time would not rest, and neither would the wax. Soon enough, the candlemaker would lift each half-set candle from its rack and return it, one by one, to the cauldron. He would count each as he dipped, steadying a dozen wicks upon the wooden frame, then lowering them until only the tips peeked from the molten amber. Each candle would grow, layer upon layer, until its shape was full and its surface smooth as river glass. Yet all these steps depended upon the craft he had just rehearsed, the careful testing of temperature, the measured breaths of bellows, the fastidious skimming of every flake of scum. Thus, with the wax at its ideal consistency and the fire tamed to his will, the candlemaker set down his tools. He straightened at the workbench, gathered the rack, and readied himself for the second dip. In the muted glow of morning, amid the steady hum of hearth and kettle, he prepared to breathe new life into each slender form. The fragrance of warm beeswax filled the air, soft, inviting, and rich with promise, and in that gentle ritual, time seemed to pause once more, awaiting the next moment of creation. And so, calm and deliberate, he began again. Well before the sun had mounted high enough to chase away every trace of shadow, a soft glow began to press its way through the workshop's narrow windows. The panes were streaked with age, tiny rivulets of dried condensation, faint fingerprints left by curious apprentices, and the dust of decades settled into invisible webs. As the candlemaker turned from the rack of pale, half-set candles, a single shaft of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating a narrow corridor of motes dancing in silent arcs. It was a moment as tender and fleeting as a prayer, and he stood perfectly still, drinking it in. He lowered his head, feeling the dust-laden air brush against his skin and the first warmth of the day graze his shoulders. The motes seemed to float in concentric circles, tracing ghostly paths from floor to ceiling before drifting back down to the wooden boards. Each tiny speck caught the light differently, some glimmered like spun sugar, others glowed faintly gold, as if harboring a memory of the bee's honeyed gift. The candlemaker let his eyes follow them, measured their rise and fall, and in doing so, felt time itself slow to match their gentle rhythm. He stepped closer to the window. On the sill, a scattering of wax shavings lay like pale fragments of snowfall. He brushed one away absent-mindedly, his fingertips warm from handling candles. Beyond the glass, the courtyard lay half hidden in mist, barrels of stored wax and coils of wick cast in soft silhouettes. A single crow called from the rafters above the forge, its note distant yet clear in the hush. It was a reminder that the world outside the workshop had begun to stir, but here within these walls, the only movement that mattered was that of wax and wick, of heat and patience, of centuries-old hands learning the slow generosity of beeswax. The candlemaker moved away from the window, crossing the worn floorboards with deliberate care so as not to scatter the luminous motes. He approached the cauldron, the great iron vessel that had warmed with charcoal and bellows since before dawn. A ribbon of translucent steam curled upward from its brim, carrying the faintest honeyed scent. The surface of the molten wax rippled in gentle waves, shifting from pale gold at the edges to warm amber at its heart. In that soft, humming pool lay promise, the promise of light to banish darkness and warmth to ward off cold, the promise of countless small comforts to follow. He paused at the edge of the hearth, letting his eyes trace the residual reflections of flame that danced in the cauldron's depths. There was a hush here, a reverent stillness that the candlemaker rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. For most of the morning he was consumed by task, measuring wicks, skimming impurities, adjusting the height of the flame until the wax glowed clear as spring water. But now, in this gentle pause, he remembered that the work was more than routine. It was a quiet ritual, a conversation between hand and heart, between generations of makers who had all stood at this very forge, bearing witness to the alchemy of heat and time. With a long, measured breath, he reached for his iron paddle. His fingers closed around the cool handle, and he lifted it from the workbench. The metal end was dark with soot, its edges smoothed by years of stirring. He dipped it into the wax, feeling the soft resistance as the molten surface closed around the blade. Gently, he drew it out. A thin sheet of wax clung to the paddle, fracturing in pale lashes before dropping back into the cauldron. Each shard bore a memory of the bee's journey, and of the fires that had borne them to this transformation. He set the paddle aside and drew nearer, balancing a small tin cup in one hand. He cupped a drop of wax and brought it to his lips, letting it cool on the back of his hand. The texture was silky, the heat radiating through his palm like a silent blessing. He considered the layers already built upon the rack just a few paces away, slender tapers, their first delicate coats now firming in the cool air. Soon they would be again lowered into this cauldron, gathering strength and form with each successive dip. But in this moment, before the second layering began, he allowed himself the luxury of stillness. Around him, the workshop stirred awake. The lathes in the corner gave a soft creak as they shifted under the warmth of the hearth. The bundles of wicks coiled beside the storeroom's open door rustled in a mild draft. Far off, the apprentice stirred at his bench, perhaps dipping a wick one last time before taking his midday break. But the candlemaker paid no heed to their movement. He let the amber light pool in his chest as he stood silent by the cauldron, savoring the hush that preceded the day's next chapter. Memories rose unbidden, the first time he had watched his own mentor stand at this hearth, teaching him to read the wax's color and measure the heat by the sound of a bubble's burst. The slow burn of countless candles lit behind choir stalls, on bedside tables, in smoky taverns, each flame a witness to births and deaths, to whispered prayers and hurried farewells. He remembered the warmth of a mother's hand as she had shown him how to roll a wick between her fingers, and the hush of a cathedral dimmed to candlelight. All of these echoes converged here, in the bright hush of morning, where the only living light so far was the hesitant sun. He dipped his hands into his apron pocket and withdrew a small scrap of parchment. On it, he had sketched the design of the next batch of candles, slender tapers with delicate spirals and subtle ridges. The second layer would be thicker, firmer, and destined for a patron who prized both beauty and endurance. He traced the faint pencil lines, imagining the liquid wax enveloping each form, imagining the day when those candles would be lit in a distant chapel, their light trembling in stained glass. The very thought imparted a new warmth to his shoulders, a reassurance that this slow craft was somehow tethered to every place where light was treasured. Finally, he set the parchment aside and exhaled, releasing the quiet tension he had not even noticed he carried. He picked up a clean bobbin of wick, its linen fibers pale and still cool in the morning air. He measured a length between thumb and forefinger, recalling the precision required in every cut, the margin for error so small that a single extra inch might cause uneven burning. He held the threads aloft, watching them dangle like pale threads of smoke, and with a deliberate motion, trimmed them to perfect length. The first candle of the second dip would be within sight now, its wax thin enough to reveal the linen wick's gentle coil, but sturdy enough to stand straight when pressed against the rack. He lifted a slender taper from the rack of half-set candles, its surface streaked with barely perceptible lines. He balanced it in his palm, feeling the cool firmness of the pale wax, noticing how the dawn light gleamed along its length. Then, with the quiet confidence of years spent mastering flame and wax, he prepared to lower it back into the cauldron's warm embrace. In that soft glow of morning, as motes danced in the air like tiny heralds of day, he resumed his task. The hush remained, but it no longer felt solitary. It was the living breath of a craft passed down through centuries, an affirmation that light, born of wax and wick in steady hand, would continue to guide each new dawn. And so, with calm determination, the candlemaker began the next layer, letting the amber liquid flow around the taper in gentle ripples, welcoming the morning's promise of further work and the slow, sure shaping of light. The morning sun, now climbing steadily toward its zenith, filters through the tall, narrow windows of the workshop in pale, honeyed beams. The air is still warm from the day's first fires, yet tempered by a faint breeze that drifts through the cracked panes. The candlemaker stands before the cauldron, its molten surface rippling like liquid gold. In the quiet hush that follows the dawn's initial stirrings, every movement feels measured, deliberate, as if the very walls of the workshop breathe in time with his own slow inhalations. This is the hour of the second layer, a deliberate, unhurried act of deepening each candle's substance, giving strength and form to the slender wicks laid out before him. He approaches the wooden rack, now bearing candles cooled and set from their first, delicate coating. Their pale shafts await the second immersion, poised like slender saplings ready to accept the next pulse of nourishment. The candlemaker pauses, hand hovering above the rack, and closes his eyes for a moment. He listens to the muted drip of wax that still clings to the underside of each candle, the faint hiss of steam rising as the surface of the molten pool shifts under the hearth's warmth. In this moment of stillness, he breathes deeply, feeling the slow beat of time, aware of centuries of tradition contained within each dip and lift. With a gentle exhalation, he grasps the side of the rack and begins to lower it into the glowing wax. The molten surface parts around the candles, swallowing them in waves of light. He counts each wick as it submerges, 1, 2, 3, his voice an almost inaudible murmur in the vast quiet of the workshop. Each number marks the union of wax and wick, the forging of the candle's girth. Under his hands, the rack descends until only the wooden frame remains above the surface, the candles fully immersed in the soft, viscous heat that envelopes them like a nurturing bath. The temperature is crucial. Too cool, and the wax will cling unevenly, refusing to spread its weight with gentle precision. Too hot, and the candles might bear imperfections, dark spots, thin veins, or bubbles that mar the surface. The candlemaker watches the subtle sheen that forms on the wax's surface, adjusting the fire's intensity with the bellows when needed, coaxing the flames beneath the cauldron into a steady, unwavering glow. He can feel the warmth radiating through his thick leather gloves, a comforting pulse that speaks of mastery and patience honed over countless dawns. After a long, silent count, he raises the rack slowly, guiding it from the liquid as the candles emerge, dripping slender streams of wax back into the pool. The drops fall in rhythmic cadence, plip, 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 each one returning to the cauldron's depths to join its counterparts. He tilts the rack gently, offering each candle a moment to drain fully, ensuring the second layer adheres in an even, substantial coat. The wax that drips away carries impurities back to the cauldron's surface, where they can be skimmed in due course, leaving behind a purer, more lustrous finish. Once the rack is free of excess wax, he lifts it into its designated doorway of light, setting it upon a low table by the window. The fresh beams play upon the candle's cool, white surfaces, revealing the thickness beneath. Each is a testament to careful calculation, the precise depth of immersion, the perfect duration of submersion, and the artistry of withdrawal. As they solidify, the candles grow stout and sturdy, their lines smooth and elegant, their forms ready to withstand the rigors of a long, clean burn. In these hushed moments, the candlemaker steps back and surveys his work. The workshop feels suspended between breaths, every tool at rest, every surface coated with a fine sheen of white wax. He notes the steady progression from the first, feather-light dip to this deeper, more robust layer. The rhythm of the ritual has become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Measure the wick, dip in slowly, lift with care, let it set, repeat. Yet each cycle brings its own small variations, its own challenges that demand the full patience of mind and body. Beyond the wooden door, the village stirs. Distant church bells begin to toll, marking the hour before midday. A faint murmur of life drifts in, the clip-clop of a cart on the cobblestones, a child's laughter carried on the breeze, the low rumble of livestock in the fields. Inside, however, time moves with a different cadence. Here, the craft holds him in its gentle current, guiding hand and eye. Soon, the candles will rest long enough to harden, ready for the trimming and polishing that come next. Today's work, though well begun, remains far from complete. As the second layer takes shape, the candlemaker allows himself a moment's reflection. Each step in this age-old process speaks of quiet devotion, to the bees that yielded their wax, to the slow, patient fire, and to the simple marvel that an unassuming wick can carry light into the darkest corners. He inhales the honeyed warmth that lingers in the air, tastes the faint sweetness of melting wax upon his fingertips. In that gentle hum, he finds a kind of solace, a reminder that even in the most ordinary of tasks, there exists a spark of wonder, carried forward across generations. With that thought, he turns to the cauldron again, ready to skim impurities and prepare for the next layer, confident that each careful dip brings him closer to the perfect candle, and with it, another subtle glow to pierce the evening's deepening shadows. The candles stand in even rows upon the rack, each one a pale column of beeswax that glimmers faintly in the soft morning light. Having received their second coating, they are now firm and cool, their surfaces smooth but not yet perfect. The candlemaker bows his head for a moment, breathing in the warm, honeyed air that drifts from the cauldron beyond. Outside, a breeze stirs fallen petals at the threshold, inside, all is hushed and still. Now begins the careful work of polishing, trimming away the smallest imperfections, coaxing each taper into flawless symmetry. He steps forward and selects the first candle, lifting it gently from the rack. The wax feels cool under his calloused palm, solid but with that signature, subtle give of pure beeswax. In his free hand he holds a narrow blade, a small, straight-edged knife forged of iron, its handle worn smooth by decades of faithful use. With deliberate slowness, he draws the edge along the length of the candle, skimming away any wisps of roughness, any tiny rivulets of wax that failed to settle evenly. The motion is steady, the blade almost humming as it parts the surface. A whisper of wax curls free, drifting softly to the worktable below. He sets the candle on the bench before him and lifts a small, hand-woven cloth, gently wiping along the entire length. The cloth is warm and textured, a fine weave of linen that catches the faint sheen of the wax. With each pass, the candle's surface grows satin smooth. He pauses to turn it, catching the light from the window at a different angle. Here and there, a minute ridge remains, a subtle imperfection almost invisible to the untrained eye. He leans in closer, eyes tracing the candle's contours as if reading the faint script of its growth. Then, calmly, he lifts the knife once more and makes a single, precise stroke, bringing the surface to a perfect, even plane. As he works, the soft ticking of a simple wooden clock on the far wall marks the passing minutes. The workshop is warm, the scent of beeswax is sweet and faintly floral. In this stillness, the candlemaker listens. He hears the gentle creak of shutters as they expand in the heat, the faint rustle of paper as a fallen ledger shifts upon the desk. Every sound is muted, inviting reflection and concentration. He closes his eyes for a heartbeat, recalling the earliest lessons, that candles are more than mere sources of light, that their quality reveals the care of their maker, and that the final polish is as essential as any layer of wax. When his eyes open, he selects the next piece. This one is slightly thicker, destined for a sturdier taper meant to burn through the long hours of a winter night. He holds it between both palms and begins to roll gently, fingers moving in a slow, circular rhythm. The wax warms almost imperceptibly under his touch, softening enough that the rolling action brings out hidden irregularities, a faint groove here, a tiny bulge there. As the candle turns, catching stray glimmers of light, the maker adjusts his grip, molding the wax back into a uniform shape. The roll is measured, too fast, and the wax could slip, too slow, and the surface will cool unevenly. He maintains a pace that feels natural, even, almost breathing. Between each candle, he pauses to whisper a word of approval, a soft murmur that seems to fill the room with its gentleness. Good, he breathes, voice barely above a sigh. Steady. True. These words are not meant for any ear but his own, yet in their whisper there is an affirmation, a blessing laid gently upon each taper. Some might call it eccentric, this habit of speaking to one's work. To him, it is simply the final rite, the moment when maker and maid meet in shared stillness. Across the table, the candles he has finished are gathered in clusters, their pale forms glancing at the workshop's windows as if awaiting permission to leave. He surveys them with a critical eye, as one might regard fine porcelain straight from the kiln. Any candle that still bears a flaw, a nick in its edge, a sliver of uneven thickness, he returns to the rack and repeats the ritual, blade, cloth, roll, whisper. Time is unhurried here, the candlemaker knows that patience is the true kiln in which perfection is forged. After some time, he lays out the trimmed candles upon fresh sheets of clean paper, marking them aside in neat groups. He notes their heights, their girths, their gleaming surfaces. These will soon be catalogued by length and purpose, tall bed candles for hearthside vigils, slender spirals for evening suppers, stout tapers for the village inn. Each group suggests its own gentle promise of light. He steps back and surveys the scene, dozens upon dozens of candles, each one touched by the same quiet attention. Light shifts in the workshop as the sun climbs higher, sending veils of warmth through the glazed panes. Dust motes drift lazily in the sunbeams, swirling among the waxed columns like minute starlings. The candlemaker closes his eyes and inhales, letting the scene settle into memory. There is solace in repetition, the dip, the cool, the dip, the firm, the trim. In the calm arc of the day, he finds a steadying tide of thoughts. He sets the trimmed candles aside and reaches for a slender, half-worn brush. Its bristles are soft but firm enough to swipe away the faintest particles of wax that cling after the cloth. With gentle strokes he glides the brush along each candle's length, from base to tip, coaxing out any last granule. The wax responds, glowing faintly under the bristles' caress. When he finishes, he stands once more and surveys the threefold array, freshly dipped, thoroughly chilled, meticulously polished. In this moment, the workshop seems suspended in time. From the hearth where the last ribbon of smoke curls skyward to the ledger's inked tallies waiting near the window, everything holds its breath. The candles, each a tiny promise of illumination, stand ready for whatever lies ahead, the midday reflection over simple bread and honey, the introduction of soft color in clay-tinted wax, the spirals and ridges that will follow. But here, in Chapter 10, the candlemaker lingers on the threshold, honoring the ritual that brings his craft to its clearest form. Slowly, he inclines his head in quiet thanks, for the purity of the beeswax, for the skill left by generations of hands before him, for this gentle labor that, at day's end, will yield a truth as simple as light in the darkness. Then, with a final glance at the polished candles, he moves to the door, ready to greet the next rhythm of the day, ease a bundle into his arms, settle to a small meal, and carry onward through the soft hours of a centuries-old trade. But the memory of these moments, of blade and cloth, of rolling palms and whispered praises, will remain, a bright, steady glow within him no matter how many layers of wax lie ahead. A hush settles over the workshop as the sun climbs to its zenith. The air, warmed by the forge and the broad panes of window glass, seems to pause for a measured breath. In the gentle half-light, the candlemaker lays down the small knife and steps away from the rack of freshly smoothed candles. Their rows of pale ivory wax, still cool to the fingers, stand like sentinels in the dappled glow. For a moment, the maker closes weary eyes, listening to the faint hum of afternoon bee-song drifting through the open window, a soft counterpoint to the distant clatter of village errands beyond the street. At a simple wooden table near the sill, a bench carved by the candlemaker's own hands, rests the midday repast. A small loaf of coarse brown bread, its crust cracked and dry, is broken in two. On a chipped pewter plate sits a dollop of honey, golden amber and thick with the scent of clover. The candlemaker dips a torn bit of bread into that honey, lifting it slowly so the viscous sweetness clings. Each bite is deliberate, teeth meet the rough crumb, honey melting upon the tongue, a fleeting warmth before the slow return of earthy grain. Time seems to slow again, measured by the steady drip of wax from the racks and the cadence of soft chewing. Outside, the village square stretches into view. Through the leaded panes, the maker watches a slow procession of daily tasks. A mother in a homespun gown leads a wicker basket of laundry to the open well. Two children in patched coats chase one another around the corner of the baker's shop, their laughter echoing faintly. A team of oxen plods through a shallow rut, hauling firewood for a neighbor across the lane. The candlemaker's gaze lingers on these scenes, each small movement a part of a larger, ever-turning wheel of life. Between mouthfuls of bread, the maker's thoughts drift back to the morning's labors. The forging of wax, the meticulous trimming of edges, the steady wheel of the paddle. Each candle, once a shapeless wick, now awaits its next bathing in molten folds. There is solace here, in this realm of tempered heat and cooling form, where hands guide shape as rivers shape stone over centuries. In that slow passage, the candlemaker finds a quiet mirror for the passing hours of life itself. A faint breeze stirs the beeswax-streaked curtains at the window. The candlemaker reaches out to close them, gently pinning their rough linen edges beneath a brass hook. The gesture is small, but it speaks of careful guardianship, as if each fold of cloth guards the hush of creation within. Returning to the meal, the maker crumbles the last fragments of bread onto a scrap of parchment. Even this remains, stale fragments destined for the hive's bees, a final offering of sweetness before the afternoon's labors resume. Pausing, the candlemaker sets down both plate and parchment and rises once more. A length of linen wick, still moist from yesterday's priming dip, lies coiled on the workbench. The maker's fingers, flecked with wax, trace its length and consider the next layer waiting in the kettle. There is comfort in the ritual, measuring, dipping, raising, allowing wax to drip away in glossy ribbons. One motion flows into the next as naturally as breath, each step a note in the unhurried melody of craftsmanship. The honey scent of midday honey mingles with the faint tang of molten wax. The maker inhales, closing eyes against the brightness. In that still darkness behind closed lids, time stretches, the 3 dips of each wick, the sibilant hiss as wax meets water in a small hearth beyond the main forge, the whisper of parchment ledger pages turning in another room. All combine into a tapestry of sound and scent, a living memory of work done and work to come. When the candlemaker next opens eyes, afternoon shadows lean longer across the floorboards. The midday meal is a memory of sweetness now tempered by the anticipation of the next phase. Later, colored wax will be stirred with powdered clay or crushed petals. Delicate spirals will form under nimble fingers. But before that can begin, there is the simple act of returning to the bench, to the kettle, to the pool of molten gold. In the rising quiet of the workshop, the candlemaker grips a length of wick between forefinger and thumb and inches forward to the cauldron. The metal coils of the kettle glow orange at their tips, a gentle reminder of what awaits. One by one, wicks will slip beneath the surface, the wax embracing each strand until it carries its fresh burden like a second skin. Later, wicks will be withdrawn and laid out on the rack, and the workshop will hum with the drip of molted wax returning to the fold. Yet for now, the candlemaker allows a final moment of pause. The bronze bellows rest at the forge's side, quiet as a turtle in its shell. The paddle leans against a pail of clear water used for sudden cooling. The workbench, though dusted with fine sawdust and flecks of beeswax, looks almost untouched. In this midday stillness, the candlemaker finds a measure of balance, between movement and rest, between the bright fervor of creation and the calm reflection of sustenance. As the beesive hum outside laps gently against the walls, the maker steps back to the window once more. The villagers move through their tasks, each silhouette etched by the high sun. For one final instant, the candlemaker allows the mind to drift along these simple lives, threaded together by the same steady heartbeat of routine. Then, softly, with careful deliberation, the maker turns and strides back toward the kettle, the wooden rack, and the unfinished rows of candles awaiting their next baptism. At the threshold between reflection and action, each moment holds its own quiet significance. The midday meal has nourished the body, the view of village life has renewed the soul. Now, fingertips stained with wax will guide the next layer of pure beeswax, and the ritual continues. And in that continuation lies the heart of the craft, a slow, deliberate unfolding, shaped by hand, warmed by flame, and illuminated, in time, by the gentle glow of each newly born candle. A pale sun had risen high above the workshop's low, tumbling roof by the time the candlemaker cast aside the remains of midday's simple repast. The narrow window beside the worktable glowed with a warm, diffused light, spilling onto scattered tools and the steady cauldron where the next stage of the day's ritual was set to unfold. After hours spent coaxing candles toward fullness in pure beeswax, the maker now sought to introduce a hint of color, an echo of meadow blossoms and the clay beds beyond the village stream. This was a slow and deliberate moment, one in which the gentle craft took on a painter's precision. First, the candlemaker cleared the tabletop of stray wax drippings and small shreds of wick. A handful of iron implements, tongs, a spatula, a tiny scoop, were laid out in neat alignment. Beside them, 2 shallow pottery bowls waited, one holding fine clay powder, the other heaped with crushed flower petals. The clay, harvested from a bend in the river upstream, possessed a cool, almost dusty scent. It was bleached nearly white by the sun, but carried within it a faint warmth of earth and stone. The petals, collected at dusk the evening before, marigold and rose, through trial and time chosen for their soft pigments, offered a delicate perfume, the honeyed sweetness of flower heads left to dry on woven rush mats. In the hush, the candlemaker reached first for the scale. It was a small device, wrought of iron and brass, its miniature pan swinging gently from slender arms. On one pan rested a polished stone weight, on the other, a fine heap of clay powder, sifted through a linen cloth to remove any coarse granules. The maker's hands, worn yet steady, lifted the stone and slid it onto the brass arm. Softly, the pans balanced. Then, with the tip of a small iron blade, the candlemaker carefully scraped away clay until the pans hung in perfect equipoise. Each fraction of a gram mattered. This clay would form the backbone of the tint, a muted, earthen color that would deepen the golden beeswax into a subtle ochre glow. Once the precise measure was taken, the candlemaker transferred the clay to a bowl and set the scale aside. Next came the petals. With a steady breath, the maker plucked a small wooden pestle, lifting a pinch of crushed marigold and rose from the pottery dish. The petals, brittle and faintly rosy orange, were weighed on the same scale, 2 small increments, no more, before being combined in the mixing bowl. A final touch, a few tiny flecks of deeply violet clover petals, gathered weeks earlier and stored in a sealed jar, introduced a gentle counterpoint to the warmer hues. The array of powders and petals lay like a miniature landscape across the bowl's surface, each grain a promise of color. At last the candlemaker turned to the cauldron itself. The wax within was molten, its surface a glassy sheen scalding to the eye. Embers glowed beneath the kettle, coaxed by a careful shuffle of the bellows, so that the wax remained fluid without charring. Holding a slender iron scoop by its wooden handle, the maker lifted a small portion of molten wax and let it drip back gently. This test drop, glowing like amber in the lantern's light, confirmed the ideal working temperature. Satisfied, the candlemaker scooped 2 ladlefuls of liquid wax into a separate, smaller pot, one fashioned for stirring dyes. The larger cauldron would wait while the pigments were coaxed into union. The smaller pot was placed atop a trivet beside the fire's edge. A long, ebony stirring rod lay ready in the maker's left hand. With measured deliberation, the candlemaker slid the powdered clay into the molten pool. There was a moment of hush, as the dry earth sifting into the liquid caused the surface to ripple in tiny, concentric circles. A soft sizzle rose as each granule was enveloped. The maker paused, letting the pigment dissolve for a heartbeat, then began to stir in gentle arcs, slow, broad sweeps that drew the clay deep into the wax's core. The sound was almost inaudible, a muted whisper of movement, like wind over a calm pond. Once the clay was thoroughly distributed, the candlemaker added the floral powders. The marigold and rose dust fell in soft swirls, tinting the wax in places like sunrise streaking a pale sky. The maker's rod carved lazy spirals, every pass capturing petals and pigment and drawing them down into the molten glow. The color thickened and brightened with each circle, shifting from a muted stone gray to a warm, honeyed ochre, flecked with tiny specks of rose. Amber streaks threaded through soft orange ribbons, as if capturing both the dust of clay and the very essence of sunlight. Steady hands continued the stirring. The maker watched the progress with quiet satisfaction, sensing the minute differences as if tasting wine by its subtle bouquet. When the mixture took on a consistent, lustrous hue, an earthy gold with a blush of rose, the candlemaker tapped the rod against the pot's rim, drawing a thin strand of color upward. As the droplet clung to the metal, it glowed like a small gem. The time had come to test on a scrap wick. Reaching to the wooden spool beside the working tray, the candlemaker drew a slender length of linen wick, one of the same threads used for the candles yet undressed by any prior coating. Holding it gently with tongs, the maker lowered just its tip into the colored wax pool. A soft plume of rising heat fogged the air, and the wax clung, shyly at first, then formed a thin sheath. Carefully lifting the wick, the candlemaker held it aloft, letting excess drip back into the pot. The drop of wax settled into a silky bead, drifting downward until the wick bore its own tiny candle cocoon. In the shifting daylight, the bead's tone shimmered between ochre and rose, an effect both subtle and enchanting. Satisfied, the candlemaker let the wick settle across the edge of a small wooden block to cool. While waiting, the maker observed the bead's surface. Did it hold any mottling? Were the tones uniform, or did they swirl in delicate veins? Was the color delicate enough to suit the village customers, those who preferred quiet warmth over gaudy brightness, yet rich enough to set these candles apart? The art lay in that balance. If the hue proved too pale, another measure of clay might deepen it; if too pronounced, a few more ladlefuls of untouched wax would soften the effect. For the moment, though, the balance seemed just right. A soft crackle from the hearth stirred the candlemaker from close scrutiny. The workshop lay hushed but alive, the cauldron murmured behind, the bellows rested like a sleeping beast, and motes of floating wax dust drifted in the still air. The wick bead had set to a firm, smooth finish. With a slender blade, the maker slid between bead and wick, severing the sample candle free. By its slender form, the colored bead glowed with a gentle persistence, neither gaudy nor dull, but a natural hue that would speak of fields at dawn and sun-baked clay. It was exactly the tone these candles had long awaited. Carefully, the candlemaker returned the wax pot to its place beside the larger cauldron. Stirring ceased. The maker retrieved a dozen pristine wicks, tying them in small bundles and dipping each bundle fully into the colored wax, deliberate, rhythmic, each immersion measured by silent count, 1, 2, 3. The bundles emerged clothed in the new hue, each slender rod thickening as drops gleamed beneath the light. They were then laid across the rack, spaced with the same tender precision that had carried the craft through the morning and afternoon. The candles rested in the warm glow, settling into their new coats, ready to dry. In the quiet that followed, the candlemaker stepped back, hands tucked into the sleeves of a woolen smock. The workshop felt transformed. Lines of pale yellow and ochre now lay upon the racks, their colors soft and inviting. Beyond the low window, a breeze stirred the leaves of a distant oak, and a gentle hum of bees drifted in from the hive behind the building. It was a moment of calm completion, the slow culmination of weighing, stirring, testing, and dipping. Soon enough, the colored candles would join their unadorned brethren, standing in neat freedom to dry fully before the next stage, the delicate shaping of spirals and ridges, where light and color would blend into an even finer art. For now, the candlemaker allowed the workshop to settle into stillness, content that the day's work had reached this vivid, earthen note. The gentle ritual of coloring beeswax had deepened the candlemaker's connection to the land and its blooms. In that quiet hush, the heart of the old craft shone once more, warm, patient, and kindled by the soft glow of pigment and flame entwined. The candlemaker paused for the briefest moment, her leather-aproned form outlined by the soft glow spilling from the forge hearth. Yesterday's work, measuring linen wicks, stirring honey dyes, and watching the beeswax shimmer in the cauldron, had prepared her for this delicate stage. Now, as mid-afternoon light filtered through narrow, dusty windows, the workshop felt suspended in a golden hush. Each tool lay ready, a slender iron hook, a smooth wooden paddle, and a simple oak rack carved with parallel grooves for holding shapes as they cooled. Before her, on a low table scarred by time and soot, rested the candles prepared in the previous chapter, plain, sturdy columns of tinted wax, pale blush and soft clay tones tapering at their tips. Today, they would become the spirals she had long practiced in dreams. She set the first group of half-formed candles beside the cauldron's gentle warmth. The wax inside had been tinted with crushed petals and powdered clay, a milky rose blending into ivory. Even at rest, the candles caught the light like living things, as though a slow breath might coax them into movement. With a low exhale, the candlemaker lifted one slender rod by its uncoated wick end. She tested its weight, ensuring that the wax had cooled enough to hold its shape yet remained pliable for the final twists. Placing her other hand beneath, she guided the candle with the certainty of long practice, fingers warmed by the lingering heat of the forge. In one fluid motion, she dipped the base of the candle once more into the molten pool, careful to submerge only half its length. The wax embraced the form with a soft sigh, fusing to the earlier layers like a gentle ribbon gliding into place. As she drew it upward, she began to twist, first slowly, then with a constant, even rhythm. Each rotation pulled the warm wax into a ridge, a tiny hill that spiraled up the candle's length. She counted each turn beneath her breath, not in numbers but in silent beats of her heart, certain that only such mindful pacing would yield the perfect curve. The twisting was neither hurried nor mechanical, it was a quiet ritual, a dance between human hand and heated wax. The candlemaker's gaze remained fixed on the surface as the glossy ridge formed, soft at first, then sharpening subtly as the wax clung and conformed. Imperceptibly, the spiral narrowed, its edges precise but with a gentle irregularity that lent each candle its unique character. When she felt the wax begin to stiffen, she held the twist, one final, deliberate turn, before lowering the candlestick to rest. Cooling air met the hot wax almost immediately. The candlemaker's fingertips, protected only by a whisper of cloth, registered the change in temperature as she laid the finished spiral into one of the oak rack's grooves. A faint click echoed as it settled, lined up neatly beside its companions. She straightened and observed the row, delicate waves of pale color, each spiral echoing the last, yet each subtly different. One coil rose a hair's breadth higher, another carried a slight kink, a testament to the living hand that shaped them. Between each candle, she left a measured space. Though small, that distance mattered, air must circulate freely for an even set. She slid her fingers along the rack, nudging a spiral or two until the alignment felt just right. Then she reached for a new stick, her movements practiced, economical. The calm ritual continued like the steady hum of distant bees, a sound sometimes audible through the workshop's open shutters. She remembered the hive just beyond the garden wall, where honey and wax began their journey. Now, here, at the workshop hearth, the craft reached its most intricate promise. Occasionally, she paused to peer through the window, catching sight of villagers strolling along sunlit lanes. Their footsteps seemed remote, unconcerned with the slow artistry within. Yet every twist and turn she shaped today would glow in parlors and hearths after dusk, guiding them home or coloring their quiet reading. That thought, softly settling in her chest, deepened her calm. She was not merely forming wax and wick, she was giving comfort and clarity, one gentle revolution at a time. Returning to the cauldron, she stirred the molten wax with her iron paddle, coaxing it back to a uniform glow. Tiny fragments of hardened slivers and air bubbles rose to the surface, and she skimmed them away without haste. Each imperfection removed would ensure that every spiral, once trimmed and lit, burned evenly, with the pale rose dye shining true. The rod of newly tinted wax traveled through her hands like a living thread, pliant, responsive, eager for form. With the paddle set aside, she resumed dipping and twisting. Sometimes she lowered the entire length at once, then lifted and rotated. Other times, she immersed only the midpoint, drawing the spiral higher or lower depending on the candle's final length. She varied the speed of her twists, here a slow, deliberate coil, there a lighter, quicker turn, producing a subtle play of shadow and light along the ridges. The workshop remained hushed, save for the soft hiss of wax settling and the candlemaker's steady exhalations. Time felt elastic, each minute lengthening beneath the heat and concentration. Once a set of 6 spirals had been formed, she paused to step back and study her handiwork. The rack held its small treasures like a handful of sea shells, each one capturing the slow momentum of the sea in its form. She ran her hand lightly along the nearest spiral's length, sensing its ridges and valleys. The wax beneath her fingers was cool now, almost firm, yet pliable enough that she could still refine the slightest irregularities. So she took a small, sharp knife and, with feather-light strokes, trimmed away a tiny bump, a rogue fragment of wax, and gently smoothed the curve until it met her exacting eye. Satisfied, she supplemented the spiral's final layer with a very thin brush of residual molten wax, wiping any seam where layers met. This final touch gave the candle a seamless grace, allowing the play of light to travel uninterrupted along its spine. Then, she returned it to the rack. Layer by layer, she repeated these steps: dip, twist, rest, trim, refine. By the cycle's end, the workshop held 3 racks of spirals, 42 candles in all. They stood like pale sentinels, waiting for the cool evening air to set their forms permanently. As the last candle cooled, the candlemaker leaned against a worktable scarred with centuries of use. She watched a single mote of dust drift slowly through a beam of late-day sun, then settle on a spiral's ridge. It glowed like a tiny star. In the quiet that followed, she breathed deeply, relishing the honeyed scent of wax and the faint memory of bees at work outside. These spirals would soon join the neatly tallied inventory, each one a gentle testament to patient hands and ancient craft. Tomorrow, the midday hush would give way to the final layering, the cataloging, the apprentice's eager questions. But for now, chapter 13 concluded in this silent reverie. The spirals rested, their ridges set, their curves perfected by the candlemaker's calm devotion. And as dusk approached, the workshop stood ready to receive the coming hours, each one a promise of further ritual, further soft illumination, further slow history whispered by light. Midday's gentle hush settles over the workshop like a soft blanket drawn across a tired body. The clatter of tools, the measured hiss of wax, the rhythmic cadence of wicks dipping and rising, all have slowed to a muted murmur. Here, in the quiet interlude between the flurry of spirals laid to rest and the careful tallying yet to come, the candlemaker breathes more deeply, letting the afternoon sun's warmth fill the corners of the room. In this lull, every small sound stands out, the distant hum of bees at ease in the hive beyond the workshop walls, the shifting of shadows across the rough-hewn plank table, the faint crackle of embers still glowing softly in the forge's hearth. A row of spiral candles, newly formed and still faintly warm, rests on a low wooden rack beside the cauldron. Their ridges catch the slanted rays of sunlight, painting delicate patterns of gold and cream against the dark grain of the workbench. The candlemaker stands motionless for a heartbeat, fingertips grazing the cool wax as if feeling for its memory of heat. Then, at last, a soft exhale escapes, an acknowledgement of time paused, of work achieved and work yet to come. Outside, in the small apiary at the edge of the yard, the bees continue their industrious journey. Their low droning drifts through the open window, mingling with the supple fragrance of honey and wax that lingers in the warm air. The candlemaker pauses by the threshold, closing eyes to savor the scent, a faint sweetness carried on a languid breeze, drifting through the shambling herbs and blossoms at the foot of the workshop door. It is an aroma that anchors the craft to the living world, a constant reminder that each candle, each ribbon of wax, began in a hive brimful with motion and life. Back inside, the candlemaker sinks onto a sturdy stool, worn smooth at the edges by seasons of rest. Hands, still marked by microscopic grains of beeswax, fold into the lap. For a few long moments, the quiet is so complete it might have been woven from the same substance as solidified wax itself. Even the floorboards seem to breathe softly beneath the weight of absence, their creaks and groans stilled by the sun's dappled concealment. The midday light itself seems to hold its breath. Through the leaded glass panes, strips of luminous gold spill onto the workshop floor, sketching luminous paths between shadows. Each beam drifts slowly, carried by the passing sun, and over minutes, unknown to the wider world, traces a delicate arc across dust-flecked benches and the spilled remnants of powdered dye. The shifting patterns mark time's quiet passage more reliably than any wooden clock on the wall, for here time is measured in the curves of a cooling candle rather than the ticking of gears. In the distant corner, a kettle of spare wax simmers at low heat, kept alive with only the slightest coaxing from the bellows. Every so often, a soft sputter rises from its surface, as if the wax itself were stirring from a half-dream. The candlemaker rises and approaches the kettle, dipping a clean wooden skewer into the molten pool. A thin strand of wax draws away, stretching like liquid honey before snapping free and curling onto the edge of the vessel. Examining it, the maker nods with mild satisfaction, confirming that the wax remains pure, free of impurities, prepared in this lull for whatever layer must come next. Yet the moment is not one for action. Instead, the candlemaker sets the skewer aside and brushes fingertips along the rim of the kettle, feeling the faint tremble of warmth against the skin. A breath of wind wanders in, ruffling the edges of a linen cloth draped over a nearby bundle of fresh wicks. They lie in hospitable disarray, awaiting their turn to be trimmed and catalogued, should the maker so decide. But for now, even these silent apprentices pause, content to rest beneath the honeyed light. On the work table, a small wooden box holds scraps of dyed wax, the vibrant ochres and gentle blushes that lent subtle hues to candles earlier in the day. A few particles escape, shedding onto the worn planks like flecks of colored dust. The candlemaker leans forward, studying them as though they were tiny gems, before gathering them slowly with the tip of a blade and returning them to their box. Each flake carries memory of clay or crushed petals, the careful weighing and stirring by firelight, the patience of dipping and drying. Here in the stillness, the candlemaker's mind drifts to the artistry bound within each hue. Beyond the bees, the world hums with life. A soft cluck from the chicken coop, a distant murmur of villagers walking home for dinner, the occasional whinny of a horse tethered at the stable door, all are reminders that even in this sheltered room, the workshop glows with connections to the wider rhythm of the day. The candlemaker lifts the lids of two small glass jars, each containing a sample wick tested earlier, one pure linen, the other lightly coated in wax to ensure firmness. The jars are nearly identical, yet inside they hold the promise of two different flames. A moment's thought is given to how each wick will draw the wax, how each will burn, and how each flame will cast its own comfort into a household hearth. Resting both lids in place, the candlemaker leans back and allows mind and body to settle into the measured beat of afternoon. A folded length of leather, once used to trim edges and smooth ridges, lies nearby. The maker picks it up, feeling its supple weight, and, without moving, presses it lightly against the palm. The leather yields, a soft thump echoing as though it were a distant drum. Even this quiet exercise is unhurried, a gentle reminder that in the craft of candle dipping, speed is the enemy of perfection. Minutes pass. The shadows crawl farther across the planks, the bees lull into a softer drone, and the sun's warmth grows more slanted, more mellow. In this sanctuary, the candlemaker's thoughts drift to the day's prospects, the counting and cataloging that must follow, the final dips awaiting the thickest coats of wax, the apprentice due to arrive before evening. But these concerns remain mild ripples on the surface of a still pond, not yet stirring the depths. Instead, there is only the present, the flicker of light through dusty glass, the honeyed sweetness carried on the air, the solid weight of cooled spirals waiting their turn, and the steady, unhurried breath of one who honors each moment. And so the workshop stands in quiet harmony, poised between what has been crafted and what will be, cradled in the gentle lull that balances work and rest, flame and wax, dawn's beginning and dusk's promise. Here, in the slow, continuous ritual of candle making, time itself seems to soften, yielding space for reflection and for that rarest of comforts, the simple peace of perfect stillness. By the time the pale afternoon light filtered through the high windows, the workshop had settled into a hushed stillness. The once rowdy hiss of simmering wax had long since softened into a gentle murmur, and the air carried only the faintest warmth of beeswax and honeyed memory. Candles of all shapes and sizes rested, cool and unhurried, on racks and benches, their waxy surfaces now firm and quietly triumphant. At the center of the room, beside a worktable scarred by years of iron skimming and wax dripping, the candlemaker prepared to undertake the most deliberate task of the day, counting and cataloging every single candle he had coaxed into being. He drew a length of parchment from a low shelf, its edges curled with age and hours spent by lamplight. The record book was open to a fresh page, its vellum pale and eager for the first strokes of ink. The candlemaker picked up his goosequill pen, dipping it slowly into a glass inkwell whose neck was rubbed smooth from countless uses. A drop of ink trembled at the tip, and he pressed it gently to the page, leaving a dark dot that grew into a neat column of tallies. Even this simple act felt sacred, the turning of raw beeswax into light, and the inextricable reckoning of how many slender candles would carry flame into someone else's hearth. He began with the pure beeswax tapers, the long, slender candles that glowed with a soft, golden hue. Each had received 3 careful dips before being polished, and each now lay in a neat row upon a plank of oak. He paused at the first candle, his fingertips brushing the smooth shaft, feeling the faint warmth still held in the wax. Then, one by one, he laid each taper in a small wooden tray, making a single stroke beside the column of marks, 1, 2, 3. By the time he reached 20, the sunlight outside had shifted noticeably, slanting through the dusty air like a golden ribbon. Next came the spiraled candles, whose ridged patterns caught the light in subtle glimmers. The candlemaker turned his gaze to the cooling rack where they rested, slender spirals of cream and rose-tinted wax, each coiled with care. He lifted the first, weighing it gently in his palm before setting it aside. With one precise stroke of the quill, he tallied another counted candle, then another. He adjusted the angle of his back, drawing a slow breath. In the quiet of the workshop, the only sound was the faint scratching of quill against parchment, punctuated by each careful placement of wax upon wood. As his tally grew, he paused to note the particulars. In the ledger's margins he wrote the date, Midsummer's Eve, and beneath it a heading, Spiral Candles, Rose Dye. He measured their length with a small brass caliper, recording inches and fractions beside the tally marks. Before long, he had amassed 17 polished spirals, each destined for the merchant's stall at the far end of the market square. He tipped his head, considering whether to ink in an annotation about their smooth sheen, but decided the bare number would suffice. He set down the quill and stretched his shoulders. Beyond the open door, he heard the soft drone of bees in the hives that lay in dappled sunlight against the garden wall. Their distant hum underscored the slow rhythm of his work. He picked up a coil of linen twine and cut lengths to bind the counted batches into neat bundles. Gathering 5 pure beeswax tapers, he cinched the twine around their midpoints and tied a simple knot. The bundle sat upright on the table like a miniature bouquet, its stems glinting dully with residue of wax. He placed the finished bundle in a shallow crate, labeling it with chalk, beeswax tapers, 5 pieces. By the ledger, he paused once more, dipping the quill to note bundles, 1, and then, beneath it, the number 5. His mind traced the day's progression, the first dip at dawn, the soft hush of morning, the gratitude of midday's break, the delicate spiral work afternoon. Each phase of production found its mirror in these careful strokes of ink. The next group to be surveyed were the lightly tinted candles, those whose wax had held a faint blush of crushed petals and clay. They lay on a separate rack, arranged by size. With meticulous care, he selected the largest of the dyed candles, measured its girth with his thumb, and recorded the result in the ledger, dyed tapers, large, 12. He traced 12 strokes in the right-hand margin, then blotted the ink with a scrap of linen. Beside that entry he left a note, slight grain visible, blend next batch more thoroughly. Turning to the medium-sized dyed tapers, he repeated the process, measure, tally, annotate. The candles stood in perfect rows, their surfaces mottled with the soft pink of rose and the muted ochre of clay. He paused to rub a thumb down one, feeling the faint unevenness of natural pigment, savoring the contrast between the smooth beeswax beneath and the gentle, earthy grain above. At this pace, the afternoon waned imperceptibly. Parchment flourished with columns of marks, and the candlemaker's hand grew steadier with each entry. He counted 24 medium dyed tapers, 14 small ones, and 9 stubby beeswax nuggets meant for short, bright glimmers in dark corners. Each time his quill rose, a tiny echo of satisfaction followed, a craft fully brought to account, an order restored to the world. When he reached the final grouping, 8 thick pillar candles, their wax opaque and perfect, he paused and leaned back. The ledger lay open across the table, a stark white plane covered in clusters of numbers and annotations. The piles of candles, bundled and labeled, filled 2 crates and half a wooden box. He ran a finger along the columns, his eyes tracing the neat lines as if reading a poem in numbers. The door to the storeroom stood ajar, promising the next shift of wax blocks, the next cycle of dipping and drying. But for now, the work of the day was complete. He set the quill aside, carefully wiping it on a folded scrap of linen, then returning it to its leather sheath. The inkwell he covered with its glass stopper, pressing it down until it clicked in place. Casting a final glance over the workshop, a place of gentle heat, quiet ticking of the wooden clock on the wall, and the faint shimmer of counted candles, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. In the hush, beyond the walls, villagers walked home with baskets of supper, children chased fireflies in lingering twilight, and somewhere, a hearth awaited the gentle glow born of his labor. With measured steps, the candlemaker closed the ledger and secured it with a length of ribbon. The day's tally stood immutable on its pages, an honest record of wax transformed into illumination. He straightened the room, aligning the crates of bundles against the far wall, aligning tools on the bench, and brushing a stray wisp of wax from the tabletop. Then, as if to seal the day's work, he lit one of his pure beeswax tapers, watching the flame steady to life. The golden glow danced softly against the walls, a silent benediction upon a quiet workshop at rest. Thus ended the gentle ritual of counting and cataloging. Soon, the final layers of afternoon would fade, and in the next chapter of his craft, the candlemaker would tend the last dipping of the day. But in these measured hours of reckoning, he reaffirmed the slow, exacting rhythm that turned raw wax into enduring light, and in so doing, honored the simple promise that every candle must be known, accounted for, and set free to bear its glow in the darkness beyond. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the workshop, painting long stripes of gold across the dusty stone floor. In this quiet hour, the candlemaker moved with a deliberate calm, each gesture measured and full of intention. After the midday ritual of counting and cataloging the morning's work, he now prepared for the final act of creation, the thick, lustrous layers that would transform soft lengths of wick into steadfast candles, fit to stand sentinel through the darkest nights. First, he set about warming the largest kettle. The iron pot, blackened by decades of use, stood upon the hearth's hearthstone. He raked the coals to one side, revealing glowing embers that parted like an offering. He laid fresh wood with care beneath the kettle's feet. Each log was chosen for its slow burn and steady heat, a promise that the wax would melt evenly and remain free of scum. As the flame licked at the kettle's brim, he adjusted the bellows in gentle, rhythmic pumps. The hiss and crackle of the fire rose to meet the hush of the workshop, forging a quiet partnership between metal and flame. While the kettle warmed, the candlemaker moved to the racks where the bundled candles waited. Each bundle was tied gently with a fine twine of hemp, knots neat and unassuming. These were the wicks that had already passed through 2 layers of wax earlier in the day, trimmed, smoothed, and left to rest in the cool, honeyed air of the workshop. Now they would be transformed one final time. He lifted a bundle and held it to the light, the pale wax reflecting flecks of amber from the sinking sun. He inspected each filament with a tender eye, readying them for their ultimate coating. At last, the kettle reached its ideal temperature. A careful test drop of wax plopped onto the floor, it set within seconds, firm to the touch but still pliant beneath slight pressure. The sound was soft, like a tiny hailstone dissolving into earth, and assured the candlemaker that the wax was neither too hot nor too cold. He dipped a wooden paddle into the molten wax and lifted a bead of gold from the sea. The wax stretched in a perfect line before breaking like a silk ribbon collapsing into itself. Satisfied, he turned his attention to the bundles once more. He took up the first bundle and, in one steady motion, lowered it into the molten pool. The candles glided beneath the surface, disappearing into the softly boiling wax. He counted silently, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, before lifting the bundle slowly. Tendrils of wax dripped back into the kettle, each drop catching sunlight and refracting it into tiny prisms of warmth. When the final drip had fallen, he tilted the bundle upright and let the wax settle around the wicks, smoothing the lines of the candles as the layers thickened with each submersion. Once the candles were freed from the wax, he carried them to a specialized rack at the workshop center. The frame, carved from seasoned oak, held iron hooks suspended from stout beams. One by one, he hung the newly dipped candles, each one suspended like a droplet of light waiting to shine. He did not hurry this step, every candle deserved its own space, its own moment to drip and harden. Under the golden glow, the wax solidified in gentle waves, and the air grew fragrant with the faint perfume of honey and heat. Returning to the kettle, the candlemaker stirred with the iron paddle, smoothing the surface. He skimmed away any tiny specks that marred the purity of the wax. Even in this final phase, he rejected haste. Every ripple he removed, every blemish he banished, ensured that the finished candle would burn clean and steady, without flicker or unwelcome smoke. He dipped the next bundle with the same care, counting each second, lifting and hanging. Over and over, the ritual repeated until every wick had received its third and thickest coating. As he worked, he let his mind drift, attentive to the subtleties of the moment. He heard the soft drip of wax like rain upon parchment, noted the shadows lengthening on the floor, felt the warmth rising from hearth and kettle. Occasionally, a stray mote of dust would drift through a shaft of sunlight, dancing in the quiet air before settling onto a cooling candle. He brushed it away with a practiced fingertip. For him, each imperfection was a chance to practice patience, to cherish the slow craft that honored both material and maker. After the final bundle was hung, he stepped back to survey the rack. The candles stood like a miniature forest of ivory spires, their plump forms glowing softly in the light. He ran a hand along the nearest wick, testing firmness with gentle pressure. The wax yielded only an almost imperceptible give before reclaiming its solid shape. He allowed himself a faint grin of satisfaction. These candles, thick and stately, would soon be trimmed, labeled, and packed for sale. Yet for now, they belonged wholly to the workshop and to the ritual that had birthed them. He took a moment to replenish his own strength, a sip of cool water drawn from the well outside, its surface dark as ink in a pewter cup. He let the water slide across his tongue, refreshing him after hours bent over wax and wicker. The walls of the workshop seemed to breathe, the wooden beams groaning softly in twilight. Outside, bees hummed in the remaining warmth of the day, their gentle droning a lullaby for the task now complete. Soon, he would trim the wicks, blotting away any stray ends, and catalog the new stock alongside the earlier batches. But before that, he paused beneath the broad window to witness how the dying light played upon the candle's surfaces. The thick layers, polished by gravity and heat, captured every stray gleam and held it still. Each candle looked as though it carried a promise, that when darkness came, it would yield to this shaped wax and linen, forged in hours of patient labor. In these closing moments, the candlemaker felt the weight of centuries behind him. He thought of ancestors who learned this gentle ritual by hearth and lantern, of apprentices who once trembled at their first dip and masters who never ceased to learn. Now, standing amid the final dip's quiet triumph, he understood that each candle was more than a source of light. It was a testament to time, to the slow passage of day into night, and to the human heart's capacity for care. And so, he lingered a little longer, savoring the hush before evening's work began. The afternoon dip finale had drawn to its close, but the candle's glow, in wax and in memory, would endure far beyond the workshop's walls. The afternoon sun lay low in the sky when the candlemaker's apprentice first crossed the threshold of the workshop. A gentle hush had settled over the rows of cooling racks, each bar bearing slender columns of ivory wax that glowed faintly in the diffused light. The air smelled of honeyed warmth and beeswax, with a faint tang of soot still lingering near the hearth. In this moment, the rhythm of the workshop paused, as if drawing breath before the lesson begun. The candlemaker, a figure of quiet authority shaped by decades of steady practice, welcomed the young apprentice with a nod and a soft smile. Here, within these walls, the most ordinary actions became a kind of ritual, and the simplest materials commanded the deepest respect. The apprentice approached the central cauldron, where melted wax shimmered like liquid gold. The candlemaker lifted the wrought iron paddle used for skimming and stirred the surface with ease, sending gentle ripples across the pool. "Observe the wax," he offered, his voice low but clear. "See how it holds the light. Notice the viscosity, how it flows in gentle waves rather than in sluggish drips. A candle must draw the eye and the heart each time it is dipped." The apprentice watched, eyes narrowing as the candlemaker paused to remove a thin layer of scum with the blade's edge. "Impurities cloud the glow and mar the finish," he explained. "Our hand, our care, must be subtler than the wax itself." Without a word, the candlemaker lifted a slender wick, already primed by earlier dips, and held it between thumb and forefinger. The apprentice leaned forward, letting the warm scent of molten wax wash over her. The candlemaker shaped the wick straight and true, aligning it between two polished iron rods before lowering it with deliberate slowness. Hand over hand, he murmured, demonstrating a measured motion. First the right hand moved down a finger's length, then the left followed a heartbeat later, each guiding the wick deeper into the heated bath. The apprentice followed with wide eyes as the candlemaker synchronized his breath with every motion: inhale, dip, exhale, lift. He lifted the wick just enough to allow a thin curtain of wax to cling to its surface. The pool rippled again, and droplets fell back into the cauldron in a muted patter. Each withdrawal was slow and constant, no sudden moves, no haste. The candlemaker's hands trembled slightly with age, yet his purpose was unwavering. Wax beads formed at the tip of the wick and then dripped away in softly glimmering trails. "Patience," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The wax will tell you when it has settled around each layer. Too fast, and the surface cracks. Too slow, and the coating grows uneven. Let your hands learn its heartbeat." The workshop remained hushed save for the distant hum of bees outside and the gentle hiss as the metal paddle met the warm wax. The apprentice swallowed, her fingers itching to replicate the movement. The candlemaker guided her wrist, adjusting the angle, reminding her to keep her fingers dry and her grip light. "A firm hold," he coached, "not a clench. The wax flows more freely when we yield to it." She dipped again, mirroring his motions, trembling with concentration. The candlemaker watched, his face calm as dawn, then nodded once when the coating appeared smooth and consistent. "Well done," he said softly, and the apprentice allowed herself a small, secret smile. He placed her newly formed candle on a rack nearby, where it would cool in the mild draft of the open door. The wax gleamed pale and smooth, a testament not only to her care but also to the candlemaker's gentle corrections. He moved to retrieve a fresh length of wick. "Each candle we make is a lesson in balance," he continued. "Balance between heat and time, between movement and stillness. You cannot force the wax to do your bidding, you must listen." He paused, as though searching for words that carried weight beyond the moment. "In years to come, when your own hands know these rhythms, you will speak to the wax as you would to a friend." By his side, the apprentice felt a warmth that went deeper than the glow of the hearth. It was the warmth of understanding unfolding, of tradition handed down finger by patient finger. She recalled the first time she had watched candles drip in so many layers, the long rows of finished work, and the toll it took to see imperfection in every bond and seam. Tonight, under this gentle instruction, those edges seemed to soften. When she asked a question, how to know when a layer was too thin, or too thick, the candlemaker answered with slow, illustrative dips. With each demonstration, the wax pooled and receded at precisely the pace he intended. He let the apprentice stand alone for a moment while he placed 2 fresh bundles of wicks at her elbow. "Try on your own," he invited. Her heart quickened. The candlemaker settled at his station but offered a steady presence rather than a hovering critique. She measured her breath, flexed her fingers, and lowered the first wick into the glowing bath. Firelight danced across her face as she guided the line of wick through that liquid gold. Time seemed to stretch, seconds lengthening into minutes, until at last she coaxed it free. The wax clung, pearlescent and uniform. She set it upon the rack, trembling with effort and pride. He leaned forward to inspect her work, running his finger gently along the surface. "Splendid," he whispered, voice soft as falling petals. "Your hand has found its footing." The apprentice exhaled, a long release that carried away her earlier doubts. He straightened then, casting his gaze across the workshop's calm geometry, the racks of cooled candles, the smoothed surfaces, the neat piles of wick waiting for the next session. "Do not race," he told her. "Soon, you will discover that each moment spent in care shapes not only the candle, but your own spirit. Patience is your truest ally in this craft." In that quiet space, guided by the candlemaker's measured words, the apprentice felt time slow to the pulse of her own dipping. The low light of dusk settled into corners of the workshop, and shadows grew long upon the beams overhead. Beyond the open door, the bees drifted home, a gentle breeze carried their distant hum. The candlemaker tapped the side of the cauldron with the hooked end of his paddle, creating a soft metallic echo that filled the room. It was a signal, unspoken, that the lesson would continue another day. The apprentice gathered her courage and bowed her head in thanks. Though the day's final dips remained ahead, a warmth of confidence had already taken hold within her chest. She traced her fingers along the surface of her finest candle, marveling at its smooth curve and soft sheen. The candlemaker offered an approving nod. "Rest now," he said. Let the wax cool, and let your mind settle. Tomorrow, we will explore color and pattern, the next chapter of your learning. But tonight, remember this: mastery is woven by the hours spent in quiet focus, one patient dip at a time. And so the apprentice stood beside the cooling rack, bathed in candlelight and borne by the steady wisdom of her teacher. Each candle around her was a silent testament to their shared craft, to the unhurried art of coaxing light from wax, and to the deeper glow of knowledge passed gently, hand over wrist, from one pair of steady fingers to the next. Evening had slipped quietly into the workshop, drawing long shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards and settling a gentle hush over the walls. The low caress of twilight filtered through the single high window, its dusty panes diffusing the last pale rays of sun into a muted glow. In this calm half-light, the day's labors lay nearly complete, rows upon rows of hand-dipped candles, each bearing the subtle ridges and spirals of patient craftsmanship, awaited their final trial. The candlemaker moved among them with a deliberate slowness, as though in no hurry to shatter the delicate peace of the hour. He paused beside a slender spiral candle, freshly cooled on its rack. The lightly tinted wax still held the sheen of warm color added in the afternoon, a soft apricot hue drawn from crushed petals and earth-mixed pigments. He lifted it gently, rolling it between thumb and forefinger to feel for any unevenness in the ridges. The twist was smooth, each coil of wax almost perfectly symmetrical. Satisfied, he carried it to a small iron stand set aside for tonight's testing. The apprentice hovered at a respectful distance, eyes wide in the mellow glow that filtered in. The young hand was eager but steady, having watched every step of the day's work with quiet reverence. Now, as the master prepared for the soft light test, the apprentice's breath was careful and hushed. The candlemaker knelt before the hearth, where a small cache of embers still glowed faintly in the ashes of today's fire. With a flint shard in one hand and a piece of tempered steel in the other, he tapped gently, coaxing a tiny spark to life. The first spark flew and vanished in a soft hiss against the metal. The second found purchase in a nest of charcloth and dried rosin, igniting into a single bright point. The candlemaker shielded it behind a cupped hand, then leaned forward to kiss the spark against the candle's wick. For a moment, only a thread of smoke curled upward, dark and sooty against the pale backdrop of the wall. Then the flame took hold. It flickered uncertainly at first, testing the warmth of the wax that lay below. As the flame climbed, the candlemaker watched its shape with careful attention. A good candle should burn cleanly, its flame slender and bright, rising straight as a finger rather than dancing wildly. It should cast a steady glow without belching smoke or sputtering. He observed the new candle, the flame steadied into a gentle teardrop, its core bright white with inner heat, its outer edge tinged with a soft golden shimmer. The light spilled across the nearest candles, illuminating their pale spirals and revealing the fine lines of each handmade coil. A light spiral of gray smoke drifted up for a heartbeat, then faded entirely as the wax melted smoothly at the wick's base. The candlemaker bent closer, inhaling the faint honeyed scent of pure beeswax warmed by flame. He noted the absence of any sharp or bitter odors, a sign that the wax had been properly purified of scum and debris. The flame burned free of crackle, free of any jerking motions. In this quiet stillness, the burn quality spoke clearly: even heat distribution, minimal consumption of wax each hour, no intrusive flicker. Still kneeling, he held his hand out as a gentle shield behind the candle, feeling the warmth wash over his fingers. Warmth should be full yet gentle, a promise of comfort rather than a harsh glare. He tracked the height of the flame with practiced eyes. It hovered just under 2 inches, tapering to a perfect point. Should the wick prove too tall, the flame would smother the wax pool and drip; too short, it would starve and flicker. This one was balanced, its wick neither excessive nor scant, trimmed to the precise length that allowed the wax to pool in a shallow, even circle without collapsing. The apprentice leaned forward then, murmuring a soft question about the momentary wisp of smoke. The candlemaker welcomed the curiosity. He explained how early smoke often results from uneven coating on the outer layers, how residual impurities in small pockets of wax can create momentary unsteadiness in a new candle's flame. He described how he would adjust the layering process tomorrow, allow the early coats to cure a little longer, flicking off any scum immediately as it rises, so that the final test would reveal a flame as pure and silent as this one. As the flame continued to glow, the workshop lights softened further, the fire in the hearth reduced to embers. The candlemaker gently rotated the iron stand, bringing the candle's light to bear upon each wall, each tool settled about the room. The dancing glow revealed the blackened paddle perched overhead, the rack still draped with half-set candles, the ledger open upon the bench, its columns of numbers neat and unhurried. This was the moment when the maker understood the tapestry of the day's work, the shaping of wax, the coaxing of form, the tending of flame. All converged in this single soft light. Minute by minute, the candle burned on, its steady illumination unwavering. And minute by minute, the candlemaker's mind turned quietly toward the day to come. He made mental notes of small refinements, perhaps a slightly slower ramp-up of heat in the morning's melting cauldron, perhaps a more delicate skim of that first bright scum, perhaps a fraction of dye less in the next spiral batch. Each observation was measured, thoughtful, weighed against the memory of seasons already past. Yet in this gentle testing, there was also satisfaction, an unspoken acknowledgement that the craft remained alive and tender in his hands. The flame was not merely a glow but a living account of every care taken, every moment of patience invested in block and wick. He allowed the apprentice a few moments more to gaze at the candle, then lifted it from its stand and placed it among the others awaiting their turn. The small spiral, now marked as fully approved, stood like a silent sentinel amid the half-darkness. Its flame had proven its worth, and in its steady warmth lay a promise, that tomorrow, as morning filled the workshop with sound and movement once more, these candles would bear gentle light into homes shrouded by dark. For now, in the soft hush of evening, they simply stood, cool wax at the base, warm flame above, a perfect union of form and function. With the test concluded, the candlemaker blew out the last ember in the hearth. He gathered flint and steel, laid aside his small iron stand, and gave the apprentice a serene nod. Outside, the first star trembled in the sky. Within, the glow of one tested candle lingered in shadow, a quiet herald of comfort yet to come. Chapter 18 closed on that gentle afterglow, leaving the workshop poised between night and the promise of a new day, ready, at last, to rest. The soft glow of the small spiral candle, lit only moments before to test its burn, has dwindled to a steady, quiet flame. In the dusky half-light of the workshop, the candlemaker stands before the hearth, breathing in the faint sweetness of beeswax mingled with the faint tang of embers. This gentle ritual of the day's end flows naturally now into the cleansing of tools, a slow and reverent practice as old as candlemaking itself. There is no hurry, each motion is deliberate, each gesture mindful. The morning's fervor has given way to a calm attentiveness, and in this twilight hour, the candlemaker moves from creation to renewal, preparing every implement for another day by lantern light. First, the leftover wax is gathered. Here, in a simple iron scoop, the soft drips that fell from candles as they were hung to set catch the warm glow of the hearth. The candlemaker tilts the scoop, watching the viscous wax pool at its base, then carefully pours it back into molds lined with simple clay or wooden frames, molds that will once again shape fresh candles. The slow, thick pour produces a gentle hum, a rising arc of gold that fills each recess of the mold. Tiny beads of wax cling to the edge, merged in a single process of reclamation and reuse. In this act, nothing is wasted, every drop holds the promise of light to come. Turning to the great copper kettle that held the molten wax throughout the day, the candlemaker loosens its iron handle hinge, setting it aside momentarily. With a small ladle, remaining pools of wax are scooped out and deposited into a shallow basin. The candlemaker pauses, fingers brushing the hardened edge, feeling its coolness after hours of heat. Then, with wooden paddles fashioned for skimming, any last traces of impurity are lifted from the kettle's bottom. A pale film of foam, impurities skimmed throughout the hours, floats away in a separate dish, destined for the small heap that will feed the smithy fires beyond the workshop's walls. Satisfied that the copper is clear, the candlemaker douses the kettle's interior with a little warm water, swirling it to lift off the final specks, then tilts it to drain, leaving the metal gleaming faintly in the lantern light. The iron paddle, its surface darkened and matte with soot, awaits next. With a soft brush of coarse hemp bristles, the candlemaker sweeps away caked wax and charcoal flecks. Each stroke carries away the residue of hours spent stirring and dipping. The bristles whisper against the cold metal, a hushed scratching that echoes in the quiet. When the paddle is free of all tarnish, it is given a polish from a scrap of old leather, buffed until the surface shines just enough to reflect the lantern's flicker. In this way, each tool regains its clarity, ready once more to coax molten wax into slender forms. Nearby, the drying racks stand in tidy rows, wooden frames that held the soft candles, now hardened, upright. The candlemaker lifts each rack in turn, inspecting for residual drips or stray filaments of wick caught in corners. A small knife, sharpened to a fine edge, trims away any excess. Then, with a cloth dampened by a drop of warm tallow, the wooden bars are wiped clean, their grain revealing pale ribbons against the lantern's glow. The racks are replaced carefully, one atop another, shelves realigned so that weight is balanced and airflow remains unimpeded. A final glance falls upon the wooden bobbins and spools of linen wick. Some are half-used, short lengths already primed in wax, awaiting their next dip. Others stand in neat piles, pale strands coiled like yarn. The candlemaker organizes them by thickness and length, wrapping fine twine around each bundle. A brief brush of oil over the woodwork preserves the natural grain, warding off moisture in the cool evening air. Then, each tool, tongs, snips, little ladles, is stacked against the wall, the handles all oriented in the same direction, a quiet symmetry that soothes the eye. With implements cleansed and arranged, the candlemaker steps back. The workspace is transformed, no longer a hive of melting vessels and rising steam, it is now a sanctuary of order. The embers in the hearth are banked down, a single glowing ember left to maintain a gentle warmth through the night. A final sweep of the broom lifts away any dust or stray wax crumbs, and the door to the storeroom is closed with a soft thunk. In the hush, the lantern's flame dances gently across smooth surfaces, flickering in turn against walls lined with photographs of past creations, spirals, tapers, colored dyes preserved in resin. This cleansing ritual is more than mere housekeeping, it is a moment of reflection. As the candlemaker wipes soot from an iron rim or rubs timber with oil, thoughts wander to the continuity of craft, to bees buzzing in distant fields, to past apprentices who learned these same strokes, to tomorrow's tasks of melting, dipping, and shaping. Each action carries the weight of centuries, a silent acknowledgement that this humble toil binds generations together. And so, with the tools ready, the workshop orderly, and the hearth's last ember alive, the candlemaker lifts a small lantern and steps toward the door. Beyond, moonlight shivers through the leaded window panes, tracing pale lines on worn floorboards. The cool night air drifts in, crisp with the promise of another dawn. For now, the fire is quenched, the door latched, and the candlemaker pauses beneath the silent stars, grateful for the day's labor, and at peace with the gentle ritual that sets the stage for tomorrow's first glow. The lantern's last sputter faded into darkness as the candlemaker bent low over the hearth, his coarse woolen sleeve brushing embers that still glowed like fallen stars. With a small wrought iron poker, he nudged the red coals beneath the cauldron to the center of the hearth's bed, gathering their warmth in one final gathering of light. A thin curl of smoke rose into the dusky air, twisting toward the low rafters before sighing away into nothingness. He paused, hand resting on the ancient iron handle of the poker, and listened to the otherwise silent workshop, only the distant drip of cooling wax, settling into hardened symmetry. Each drop sounded like a distant raindrop on a summer eve, patient, measured, unhurried. When at last the embers cooled to a dull ash, he lifted a small leather bellows and gave a gentle exhalation one final time, extinguishing the very last tendril of flame. The hearth's warmth diminished at once, replaced by the creeping chill of nightfall. In its stead, moonlight crept through the narrow, dirt-streaked window panes, casting slender beams of silver across the workshop floor. The candlemaker straightened, brushing a faint smudge of soot from his rough linen sleeve as he reached for the iron latch high upon the great oaken door. Turning the latch home with a soft click, He felt the wood's grain beneath his palm, the same grain that had felt his fingertips for more seasons than he could recall. The door fell shut behind him, sealing the world of melted wax and whispered prayers for clarity inside. Outside, the village lay hushed under a gentle blanket of midnight blue, the rooftops glimmering with dew in the moon's silvery gaze. A solitary owl called from the church steeple, its voice echoing once, twice, then fading into the quiet. Beneath the moonlit window, the candlemaker paused, inhaling the crisp night air. It was cooler now than at any hour of the day, carrying hints of damp earth, lavender from a neighbor's garden, and the distant tang of wood smoke from hearths across the valley. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting these nocturnal fragrances weave through his senses. Each breath felt like a blessing, an affirmation of the simple, measured life he led. He whispered words of gratitude, soft syllables that seemed almost too precious for speech, giving thanks for the bees that labored through heat and storm, for the linen wick spun by patient hands, for the fire that shaped the soft wax into enduring light. He thanked the silent workshop itself, with its sturdy tables scarred by centuries of use, its racks grooved by thousands of dipped candles, its iron tools darkened by soot and time. In the hush of midnight, he felt the presence of the generations who had come before, the master candlemakers, the apprentices who learned by watching, the villagers who depended on those glowing tapers to illuminate their homes and hearts. A soft breeze stirred the curtain by the window, rustling the heavy fabric as if to underscore his solitary vigil. He watched the linen bobbin lying still on the workbench and the neat stacks of beeswax blocks on the low shelf, their pale, creamy surfaces faintly visible. For a moment, he considered the task that awaited him come dawn, to relight the hearth, to stir the cauldron, to continue the slow, unbroken ritual of dipping and drying. The thought brought a gentle smile to his lips. Though the day's labor had ended, the craft itself was unending, a cycle more ancient than any human lifespan. Stepping away from the window, he moved slowly across the flagstones, each footfall deliberate and soft. His fingers trailed lightly over the cooling racks where candles of every shape and hue stood ready for morning inspection. Some were tall and slender, others spiraled like seashells, some glowed faintly yellow, others hinted at soft rose or muted sage. All bore the minute imperfections that whispered of hands at work, of time and care melded into wax and wick. He crouched by the cauldron one last time, lifting the heavy lid that had kept the next day's wax warm beneath a blanket of ash. The molten surface lay still, an oily mirror reflecting the high rafters and the pattern of wooden beams overhead. He wiped a thin film of residue from the rim, then snapped the lid closed. Even this small gesture felt sacred, as though he were sealing away not merely wax but the spirit of the workshop itself until morning's light returned. Behind him, the wooden racks awaited the slow drip of wax that would herald the first delicate layering come dawn. Each candlemaking season had its own rhythm, the harvest of wax, the tending of fire, the measuring of wicks, the patient layering of melted beeswax until a candle possessed both strength and radiance. Tonight, that rhythm rested in silence, a poised breath before the next exhale of creation. He straightened once more and, with a final glance at the tools, poker, bellows, paddle, knife, he gave a small bow of the head, acknowledging their faithful service. In their worn edges and gentle curves he saw the echo of every hand that had ever held them, every eye that had ever beheld the soft, steady glow of candlelight in this workshop. At the threshold of the door, he paused again, one hand resting on the wooden frame. Beyond lay the sleeping village, the fields that waited for the sun's return, the winding road that led to distant markets and eager customers. Ahead lay the deep mystery of night, the realm of dreams. But within the workshop lay the heart of his world, the unborn candles poised to be, waiting patiently in the dark for the warmth of morning. With one last inhale of the night air, cool, refreshing, brimming with possibility, he released a whisper of thanks. Then he turned, closing the door fully this time, and made his way down the narrow path that led home. Behind him, the workshop settled into its gentle solitude, the hearth cold but the promise of resurrection held within the silent cauldron. Under the careful watch of moon and stars, the ritual slumbered until the slow, glowing craft awakened with the next dawn.